Hello, we're here speaking with Mr. Pace, and the topic of discussion will be anthropology, entitled The Reasons Why.
What is fact?
What is fact? A fact is something that's well established, something that could be well established by scientists, anthropologists,
Hmm.
something that's verifiable, that's been tested many times.
Okay, okay. Now, what is evidence, and what would be the difference of the fact?
Evidence would be something that's verifiable through multiple paths, so a multiple set of facts.
Mm-hmm.
That would be evidence, something that's been built up through different means, or perhaps anthropology, whether it's linguistical or historical, what's been found in the ground, if you will, bones, fossils, etc.
Okay. So,
The difference between fact and evidence is that evidence is a collection of facts.
gotcha, gotcha. Well, taking to the next question of the origins of mankind, I'm sure probably going to be presenting evidence. So, what is the origins of mankind?
Well, the origins of man, of course, is found in Africa, the
Mhm.
continent that we call Africa now. Um, the beginning will be the first hominid series, which the first one that scientists will call Australopithecus.
Okay.
So Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, which is working man, and Homo erectus,
Hmm.
which is the one that migrates out of Africa.
Gotcha. Saying that like 5 times fast, that's a mouthful right there. So, going to like where man began and you establishing the evidence of that. What is the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians or Nubians, as they call them?
Well, the ongoing controversy would be what color, what phenotype was the ancient Egyptians, and they were black, as well as the ancient Nubians before them. There was a Greek historian by the name of Diodorus Siculus,
Mm.
and in his writings, he said that the Egyptians are but a colony of the Ethiopians.
Mm.
So when he's talking about the Ethiopians, he's talking about the people of Kush.
Okay.
Kush is the land below Egypt, which is the whole of Sudan, possibly parts of Ethiopia, if not the whole of Ethiopia, that whole area below Egypt, which would be, below Upper Egypt,
Okay.
because the Nile flows from the south to the north.
Gotcha.
And so when Diodorus Siculus states in his writings that the Egyptians are but a colony of the Ethiopians, he's saying that they're a splinter off of the Ethiopians, that they are a part of the same group.
Okay.
And so when we look up the ethnicity of the Nubians, they're classified as Negroid, ranging from a dark brown to jet black skin on average, skin complexion. When we look up the history of the Nubians, of the people that are still there in Sudan, and the artwork and all the skeletal structures, all that information,
Okay.
and that the Egyptians are a colony of them as well.
Okay. So, you said Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and I'm guessing like and then Kush as well. That's more like the historical
Mm-hmm.
location. So, what? I don't know. Just to make sure I'm on the same page, like which one was like the start? Like, where's the origin?
The
in that
origin is in the south,
Origin,
so
okay.
it's below Egypt. So a lot of places, and this harkens back to prehistoric man,
Mhm.
because ancient Egypt, what we call ancient Egypt, what the Greeks renamed Egypt,
Mm.
the original name for the country is Kemet.
Okay.
And so the what prehistoric man did over 200,000 years ago,
Mhm.
the speech, the arts, the sciences, Australopithecus, or Homo habilis being handyman,
Mm.
Homo ergaster being the working man,
Mm.
tool making. You find some of the earliest forms of speech in the Congo or Zaire in Central Africa, So all of this comes to a culmination in Egypt. Well,
Okay.
first in Cush, and also the land of Taseti, which is the land of the bow. That's what it translates to. All of that comes into a culmination in Egypt.
You said the land of the boat?
Yes, that's what Taseti means.
Okay, got you.
And so all of that, what ancient man was doing, what prehistoric man, archaic man was doing, led to ancient Egypt.
Okay.
First Cush, Sudan, and then later on Egypt.
All right, so I'm assuming that, ancient man being kind of like hunter-gatherers, so that's what led them to this, or did they get there through the boats, or like how, like...
Well, what ends up happening is the civilization is built in the south. So in Kenya, according to Dr. Leonard Jeffries, he talks about the plant domestication in Kenya going back 32,000 years ago.
Okay.
And so you have different elements of civilization that come together in the south. And these different groups that are called the Kushites. And sometimes, the Kushites and Nubians, they're the same people. So when Diodorus Siculus mentions the Ethiopians, he's talking about the people of Sudan. He's talking about the whole of Africa. Because when we look at old topographical maps, old maps, the entire continent was once called Ethiopia. It was called Balad al-Sudan, which translates as the land of the blacks. In the Bible is called the land of Ham. Egypt, the whole of Africa, is identified as the land of Ham. It was called Cush. Okay. And Cush in Hebrew translates as black.
Gotcha.
The word Ham or Quam in the Hebrew, you can say Ham, you can say Cam. These are different derivatives. It all means the same thing: black, dark, and burnt. And Ham is the son of Noah, who is the progenitor of the Africans after the flood. Looking at it from a historical and biblical perspective.
Okay. Now, where are the Moors introduced into, like, in this area, in this time period?
The Moors come later on, after all of this. The Moors reintroduce civilization to Europe. This is, thousands of years after Egypt. This is around 711, AD. You have the Moors going into Europe.
Okay, and what's the Moors' ethnic background?
The Moors are black.
Okay.
Dr. Chancellor Williams says that the Moors, like the ancient Egyptians, are black.
Gotcha.
And even when we look at the etymology of the word Moors, it translates as black. And we can, there's different routes to prove that the Moors are black. There were two French anthropologists, Lucien Berthelon and Ernest Chautré. They went all throughout North Africa. They studied the Phoenicians, they studied the Moors, they studied the different bones all throughout North Africa, and confirmed that the Moors, the ancient Phoenicians, that they were Africans, that their bone structures are Negroid or Africoid in their description.
Okay. And what is the meaning of Moor?
The word Moor means blacks.
Blacks. Okay, gotcha. Okay, now what is the significance of West Africa?
West Africa, Timbuktu is once called. Timbuktu is located in Mali, and so that's in the western region of Africa.
Okay.
And Timbuktu was once called the Paris of the ancient world, the Paris of the medieval world. And so there's a whole medieval ancient history in Timbuktu as a center of learning. And Malcolm X did a speech at the Michigan State University, and he was talking about the American black man, how we don't know about where we came from. So he mentions ancient Egypt, and he also mentions Western Africa. He mentions Timbuktu. He mentions Mali and Songhai, and he talks about how these civilizations were highly advanced and they produced scientists and sciences. And that this was during the time period where the people up in Europe didn't even know what a book was. And they didn't have the level of education that the Africans had in terms of scholarship, in terms of the arts and the sciences.
I mean, nowadays it's just like, all right, well, if you were to think about the Black Americans and education and things of that sort, it's almost flipped.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how are the Black, and African Americans connected with the Hebrew?
There's quite a few things to look at.
Uh-huh.
In terms of, there was many different Hebraic things that our ancestors brought over here from, when they left out of Africa. It really goes back to 70 A.D. under the General Pompey, when he invaded Israel, and these black Hebrews, were attacked by the Roman General Pompey, and they had to flee their land. And then they left many of their scrolls. They left many of their Hebrew writings and all the information about their languages, all of that, their books, their scrolls. And they fled into the Western Africa, the west of the Sudan, west of Western Africa, to hide amongst the indigenous population there, to hide from the Roman occupation under General Pompey in 70 A.D. And so what ends up happening, some of them get kind of mixed up into the ethnic tribes that are there. And so there's a book by a man by the name of Rudolph Windsor, From Babylon to Timbuktu, and he talks about how some of these black Israelites got caught up into the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay.
And so when we look at the culture of the people that are African Americans or black, or that are called by these names, African American, Black Americans, we look at some of the historical elements. So you have songs such as Kumbaya, Kumbaya, Kumbaya Way, that are sung by the slaves. Go down Moses, way down into Egypt land. The original name of Harriet Tubman was a Hebrew name, and so Amir Ross.
Okay.
And so, all these different things. The church, there's a church in Savannah, Georgia, the first African Baptist church, and you see the cursive writings of Hebrew written on the pews. And so there were some stories that were published online in different places talking about that. So there's definitely a strong linkage between Hebraic culture and Black Americans, or Black people in the diaspora.
Okay.
And there's even old documents that interchange the word Hebos with the word Negro. And there's even documents that have the names of the slave ships, some of the Hebrew names of the slaves, and the ship that brought them over, the year that brought them over, all of that.
Gotcha. Well, I guess when you say Hebrew, a lot of times you think about Jewish
Mm-hmm.
rather than Black. So, where's the disconnect?
Well, there's a difference. There are white Jewish people, and then there are the actual biblical Hebrew Israelites. Because you can have a group of people that pockets of them may have went off and intermixed and became lighter over time in terms of their complexion. They can go from looking like Wesley Snipes to looking like Brad Pitt, And so due to just, generations of intermixture or certain groups of people going off and intermixing, so you have the 11 tribes occupying the northern region of Israel, Judah occupying the south, the southernmost portion of Israel. And so at different points in time, like I said, there was some intermixture at different points in time. Certain ones amongst the 11 tribes, the other 11 that occupied the north, some of them may have had some Greek wives, Greek concubines, whatnot. But in Judah and the south, not so much, because of the priests didn't want them intermixing very much. And they were, as a whole, as a group, they were very strict about intermixing. But how did the children of Israel become black? See, that's the real question. So, first of all, we go all the way back into the Bible with the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So Shem has a son named Eber, and Eber is the first Hebrew. So Eber leads to Terah. Terah is Abraham's father. Abraham's father Terah, Abraham and his father come up out of a place called the Ur of the Chaldeans. So these are very dark-skinned Hebrew people. You know, Southwest Asian, what people would term as being Middle Eastern, but they're very dark-skinned people. They're not quite the phenotype of an African, but they're not European. So they're, you know, some of them have more, you know, straighter hair, possibly some might have more curly hair. Shem in the Hebrew translates as dusky, so these are very dark-skinned Hebrew people. So just being 70 in number, when they leave the land of Canaan and go into Israel, they, even before they're in bondage, they're intermixing with the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Cushites. Judah's wife was a Canaanite, Tamar. Joseph's wife was an Egyptian. At this point, there was no difference in the look between Hebrews and Egyptians. So at this point, they're all black. And so even Moses is mistaken to be an Egyptian. Joseph was mistaken to be an Egyptian. So they're indistinguishable from the ancient Egyptians, on average ranging from a dark brown to jet black skin complexion.
So was like with the Egyptians, Canaanites, and everything, was there that cultural difference, or would you say there's like a similarity, even nowadays, where it's just like, okay, most black people understand it, like they go under kind of the similar umbrella of being African American. Was that the same, or was there differences within the culture?
Well, they were all black,
Yeah.
and so the difference was cultural and spiritual, but the physical difference was cultural between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, because you couldn't tell them apart at first by looking at them first glance. Between what we would say a Kemite and a Shemite at that point, because they were both black, but they're two different people or two different groups of people. Like how I could be mistaken as somebody from Kenya, I could be mistaken for somebody in Nigeria.
Okay.
We're not exactly the same people, but we are both black.
So, like timetable wise, you know, I'm assuming that this spans a while. So it's like, is there a timetable where like different bodies and groups of people like ruled, or like
As far as Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, well, even in Egypt, there are like the Kemites, and I know like the Egyptians. There's a time, you know, difference between the two.
Well, the Kemites, and Kemite is another way of saying Egyptian. The Greeks renamed the country Egypt. The original name of the country was Kemet, or you could say Kemet, or simply KMT. You know, which translates as black, or the land of the blacks. And so that's the strongest word for blackness in the ancient Egyptians' pharaonic language.
Okay.
So to answer the question, it would be there were different invaders that came in and took over when the civilization was in decline.
You've discussed a lot of cultures. Could you give us like a timeline or estimated timeline of people groups? You know, if you can.
Well, when we're talking then about ancient man, like our more modern time period, more modern heritage, that will be 200,000 years ago, of what scientists would call the genetic atom.
Okay.
Okay, and some would say a Dotu man. And so, you know, the genetic atom will be around 200,000 years ago. That's not the same exact man at the very beginning at the Garden of Eden, but National Geographic has come out with a facial reconstruction of what he would have looked like.
Okay. So this is like the first proof of evidence of man.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you introduced a lot of people groups. Could you give a timetable for those groups being introduced within the area as well? Because I know that they kind of overlap within the Fertile Crescent.
Well, when we're talking about Homo habilis,
Mhm.
it could be anywhere between 1.5 to 1.2 million years ago.
Hmm.
So around it would in terms of Homo ergaster, that would definitely be around 200. Some may would push it out 300,000 years ago.
Okay. So the genetic Adam would be closer to Homo gaster.
Yes, yes, he would be Homo ergaster. He would
Okay.
be of that same kind of Cushitic ethnic stock.
Mm-hmm.
Basically the same thing we are now, but very dark skin, very black skin, very big facial features.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not much of a difference. So I would say the Homo sapien that we are now,
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, is there any I guess, group in between Homo gaster and Homo sapien, or is it those that
Yes.
are next to each other?
So it goes like this: is Australopithecus is the first one,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the one that some scientists may not be able to tell whether it's identifiably all the way human or whatever. They'll say stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Australopithecus, then there's Homo habilis, and then there's Homo ergaster, which translates as working man. Homo habilis is handyman, and after Homo ergaster is Homo erectus. So Homo erectus is the one that branches out of Africa around between 40 to 60,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe older than that now. But that's when they begin to migrate out of the continent of Africa from the Great Lakes region. That's where you find all these ancient hominids. So that's down towards Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, even below Ethiopia, around, that eastern central region of Africa.
Okay. And these are all African descent.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Ranging from a dark brown to jet black skin complexion. Very black skinned people, most of them.
Mm-hmm. And then you said that there's a mixing or people mixing that is introduced later?
That comes later, much later, when we're talking the Greco-Roman period of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So that happens. So Greco-Roman, Greco-Roman. So Greek, then Roman. So Alexander the Great invades Egypt or Kemet in 332 BC. So at this point in time, the Egyptians don't identify them as an enemy because they taught them. So the Africans taught the Greeks. They got their knowledge from the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't identify. So the Africans, the original Egyptians, the Kemites,
mm-hmm.
they don't identify Alexander the Great and the other Greeks as their enemy at first.
Mm.
You see some of the Egyptian men performing marriage ceremonies between Greek men and Egyptian women or Kemetic women. And so you see somewhat of a mixture that begins to take place after they have this war. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the Egyptian men or Kemetic men are being killed at war. Mm-hmm. And so they're all still black at this time.
Okay.
And so what ends up happening, the Egyptian men are being killed at war. And so that's when you begin to see this mulatto population begin to pop up. And then just a year later, in 333 BC, the Romans invade Kemet or Egypt. So when the Greeks invade and they begin to take over, they rename the country Egypt. Mm-hmm. Then in 333 BC, the Romans come in and they rename the country Aegyptus. Mm-hmm. So that's when you begin to see more intermixture. And so a lot of this intermixture is taking place in the northern region of the country, not so much in the south. In the south, a lot of them are still black, still have a very dark skin complexion. And then you fast forward to December 639 AD, there's the Arab invasion. Mm-hmm. And so there's intermixture in the north there. So you have a group of Arabs called, you have the main Arabs, and then there's another group of Arabs called the Mamluks that come in and fight the main Arabs and push them out into other regions of Africa, such as, possibly Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, places like this.
Okay.
What is it, the Menlock? What is it, the Menlock?
A Demenlock, this is a type of Arab. It's a type of Arab. And so they come in and they fight the main Arabs. The main Arabs lose, and then they go and they migrate into other parts of Africa, or other parts of the northern region of Africa. And so the Africans are still there. They're still black during this time. So the Mamluks come in, the main Arabs come in. The Mamluks are still in Egypt during this time. They still have taken over Egypt with the Greeks and the Roman, remnants. Right? They're kind of the few of them that are left, because at this point the Romans have gone into other parts of Africa as well to take over North Africa. And so at this time, the Africans are fighting against the Romans, and so they asked the Arabs to help them fight, and they do. But what ends up happening, the Arabs take over as their new oppressor.
So I know that there is like a dispute between like the true group, a true Hebrew Israelite. So when is that people group introduced? Is that before the Romans, or just because I know that there's a dispute between like the Jewish and the actual Hebrews.
Well, when we're talking about true Hebrews and all of that, they could be Hebraic by faith. Some people speak of a bloodline, different bloodlines. There are different types of bloodlines. There's the Davidic bloodline. There's the Solomon bloodline. There's the Aaronic priesthood. You have so many different bloodlines that are mentioned. And so there's DNA testing and different things to verify that. But when we're talking about the Israelites, when they come out of the Exodus, a bunch of them are looking like the Egyptians, and a bunch of them were Egyptians and Canaanites and Cushites that had all intermixed. At this point, they're all black. The Bible even says in the book of Exodus, and a mixed multitude left with them. So that mixed multitude he's talking about, that Moses is making mention of, is these different groups of Africans that were in there with them that had intermixed, and they, and a lot of them was looking like the Egyptians themselves. Moses was mistaken to be an Egyptian. And so at this point, a lot of them didn't look indistinguishable from the ancient Egyptians, and the Cushitic Nubians, or the Nubians. Cushite is Nubian, same person, same people we're talking.
Okay.
The people of the Sudan, the southern Sudan, some of the blackest people in the entire world, skin complexion wise.
Okay, Christian. What's the significance?
Well, the significance of this information is to educate people. Many people are ignorant of the facts of ancient world history and how things began, and the factual information and evidence. So that's what makes it, this information is very vital. Black history, ancient African history being the foundation for human history. And so that's what's very significant.
And so why, along the same lines, why is it important that the record be set straight?
It's important because it is the foundation. It is the beginning. The beginning should be treated as the beginning, should be treated as the foundation. A lot of times, ancient Black history, ancient African history is being treated as a side note. A lot of times here in the Western world, in Europe and the United States, especially have done a great job of tearing down the foundation, tearing into the foundation with false history, false imagery.
So what needs to happen on an educational level to sort of right this?
The history books needs to be changed. The historical information needs to be set straight and be made correct in terms of what's being taught from high school back into middle school, from high school all the way into college. The correct information needs to be taught.
Yeah, we have a very Eurocentric sort of education in this country and in Europe as well. So, what needs to happen on a spiritual level?
Well, people need, of course, a lot of the pastors, particularly in many black churches, they in all churches, but especially in a lot of the churches that have a predominantly black congregation, needs to learn about black presence in the Bible, African presence in the Bible. They need to understand the truth of all of this information. They need to understand the culture of the people that are being dealt with in Scripture in different places.
So, why is that important? Is it important for all people, for the world to know the truth, or just the people in the church, do you think?
No, everybody should know the truth. Everybody in the entire world should know the truth, and the correct information needs to be shown, particularly here in America. To sort of quell these layers of ignorance that we've been seeing here in 2020, especially.
Right. And what's the reason? Why do you think there's been such more of a propensity to tell a lie than to tell the truth about in regards to history?
Well, it's easy to deceive a man that doesn't know who he is. It's easy to deceive a group of people that don't know who they are. It's easy to keep them down, but when you know who you are, if black people understood who they are, they understood what this history meant, it would be difficult for white supremacy in the United States, for the ignorance that festers in the United States, American ignorance, to fester. But when you have a bunch of false history, a bunch of false Eurocentric history being taught and being pumped out, fake images, all kinds of stuff, recrafted images of even, ancient Egyptian artifacts being recrafted. And, I've seen plenty of pictures of stuff like that.
They knock the nose off of the statues.
Oh, yeah. Even scrubbing the paint off and just kind of recarving images. They've done a whole lot to try to hide the truth of this information, to perpetuate a Eurocentric lie and put Europeans and put white people in a position in the ancient world that they were not in, except as an invader.
I found that it's become harder as more truths are unveiled.
Absolutely.
Like when they found those big treasure trove of mummies, how they didn't even share the ethnicity of them. They didn't even show them on camera.
Absolutely.
And I thought that was pretty amazing, but also quite telling.
Absolutely.
That they want to keep this false imagery at the forefront.
Absolutely. This is part one of the reasons why ancient Kemet and ancient Kush and the origins of man. All right, so now I'm going to get into the anthropology of proving the blackness of the ancient Egyptians and Nubians, and also getting into debunking some of the myths that are out there concerning the ethnicity or the phenotype of the ancient Egyptians. So the country of Egypt was once called, and they also called themselves by this name here, KMT, or Kemet. So this word here means black. So this word Kemet, it can be spelled like this. It can be spelled like the word Kemet. And in the Hebrew, it relates to the son of Noah. There were three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, or Ham, Sham, and Japheth. But it relates to his son, Ham. And Ham can also be spelled as Cam. can spell it like this, C-H-A-M. And so all of these words here, in the Hebrew, the word ham means black, dark, burnt. So that's what ham in the Hebrew, that's what it translates as black, dark, and burnt. And it's the same when we're talking about this word here, kemet. So Ham has 4 sons. Cush, Punt, Mizraim, and Canaan. So Ham's first son is Cush. Cush has multiple derivatives of the word Cush. So you have this word Chus, Kish, Cash. So all these words, so this word Cush in the Hebrew means black. So all the derivatives, they all mean black. Okay? So Cush, Sudan / Ethiopia. So that's what Cush. Cush is the oldest son of Ham. So Punt is Somalia. So Mizraim or Mishraim in the Hebrew translates as burnt faces. So Mizraim. So Mizraimites are burnt-faced people. Okay? And Mizraim is Egypt or Kemet.
You'll be able to get it, and then later on you have to take it out. So kind of looks like that. Especially when it's like this, the direction. So whenever he talks, it sounds the clearest. It's just something interesting once you your mics.
So we have Kemet and Cush. So the Greeks renamed it as Egypt, Cush, Ethiopia / Sudan. So Kemet and Cush, so Egypt and Sudan. So this term Ethiopians was a word that was used by the Greeks to describe the entire continent of Africa. There was a time where the entire continent was called Ethiopia, Kush, Balad al-Sudan, or the land of the blacks. And the Greeks would name all blacks Ethiopians. And so the word Ethiopians comes from the Greek word athos, which translates as burnt faces. So it means the same thing as the Hebrew word Mizraim. The Greek word Athos means the exact same thing as Ethiopian. Or Ethiopian is the term the Ethiopians is derived from, which is Athos. It means burnt faces. So we talked about one of the Greek historians, Diodorus Siculus, who described the ancient Egyptians as being but a colony of the Ethiopians. So they're but a colony of the burnt-faced people. These are people with black faces. And the word Kemet, which is what they called their land, is also spelled as Kemet. And this is different forms of this same word here. You know, Kemet, you can spell it Kemet. Simply Chim, Cham, Cam, Kime, Kheme, Kime, Kim, Kimi, or Cam, Kham. And all of these words means black. And this is what the ancient Egyptian called himself. Also, one of the main ways we also know that they're black is there were other Greek historians. There's a man by the name of Lucian.
Hold on. Who's black? Who's black?
What do you mean?
You said they. I just want you to be more direct.
Oh, okay. The Greek historians.
Okay, yeah. So say that one more time. And,
Okay.
Alright.
One of the main ways that we know that the ancient Egyptians were black is through the eyewitness testimonies of the Greek historians. Other than Diodorus Siculus, we have Lucian. There's a Greek historian, Lucian. He says this. He says that the Egyptian boy is not merely black, but he also has thick lips. So he's describing his skin complexion. When he says he's not merely black, he's saying that not only is he black, but he also has thick lips. There's another Greek historian that describes the ancient Egyptians as having a snub nose. So a snub nose is a flat nose. It is a wide nose. And we have more contemporary descriptions of the monuments. There was a man by the name of Vivant Dinan who saw the Sphinx. He was there around the time of Napoleon's army and possibly could have been a part of Napoleon's army, Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte said this. He says that history is the lie that it is agreed upon. So, but Vivant Dinan says this. He says that he describes the way that the Sphinx looks prior to its disfigurement. He says that the mouth and the lips, which are thick, talking about the Sphinx, talking about the way that it looks. He says that the head and the proportions are mild, that it's gracious and tranquil, talking about the way that the monument makes him feel. Then he goes on to say that the character is African, talking about the overall profile of the face, the way that the face looks. And then he goes on to say, he says that art must have been at a high pitch when this monument was erected, talking about the Sphinx. There was another man by the name of Count Constantine de Beauharnais. During the time period of 1787 to around 1791. And this is what he says. He looked at the face of the Sphinx, And he says this, he describes the facial features as being typically Negro. And all of its features. Talking about the Sphinx. He says that it's typically Negro in all of its features. Then he goes on to say, I'm reminded by the remarkable passage by Herodotus that the ancient Egyptians were true Negroes of the same type as all native-born Africans. Then he goes on to say, that being the case, I see where their blood were mixed for several centuries with that of the Greeks and the Romans, losing the intensity of their original color, but maintaining nonetheless the imprint of their original mold. So he's referencing what I talked about earlier, the Greco-Roman invasion starting at 332 BC, and then the Romans invading in 333 BC. Count Constantine de Beauharnais says this, just to think, this race of black men today are slaves. And the object of our scorn. Is the same race to which we owe our arts, our sciences, and even the use of speech. So that's Count Constantine de Beauharnais around the time period of 1791. Between 1787 to 1791.
And how is this significant, like in terms of this? How is this significant to Egyptians and different things that you're referring to?
What do you mean?
What I mean is so Count Constantine, is that what it's
Count
called?
Constantine.
Count Constantine. How is this information applicable to like what today? Like,
Well, I'm proving the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians.
okay,
Mm-hmm. And it's proven that they are phenotypically the same as our ancestors that were brought over here.
okay,
Mm-hmm. So the ancient Egyptians, this is what Count Constantine de Beauharnais is stating. He's stating that phenotypically, that the same people that were enslaved are of the same ethnic stock as the ancient Egyptians.
and how would you interpret what he's saying as well?
How would I interpret it?
How would you interpret it?
He's saying that these are the people that they brought over here are the same people that created the arts, the sciences, and even the use of speech. And that harkens back to what I was saying about prehistoric man or archaic man in the southeastern region of the Nile Valley, down towards the Great Lakes region, and also in Central Africa around the Congo and the Zaire, where you find some of the most ancient forms of counting, the Ashango bone in the Congo, and all these in the original usage of speech, what anthropologists, archaeologists will call paleosyllabus, which are the most ancient form of writing ever done by human beings. Homo ergaster, or working man, doing paleosyllabus, which is pictorial language, which led to the Paleo-Hebrew and the classical Greek, all of that. It's a very ancient African language going back hundreds of thousands of years ago. Paleosyllabus. And that all of these arts and sciences that de Beauharnais is talking about and even the use of speech. It comes to culmination in Egypt, and what he's stating here applies beyond just Egypt. It really applies to the entire continent of Africa, is what I'm saying. And it's not only Egypt, Egypt is the most recognizable of what he saw.
That was great. When you broke that down.
Appreciate you. Further evidence. There's a man by the name of Gerald Massey, and he wrote a book called Egypt, the Light of the World. And on page 251, he says this. He says that the insignia of the pharaohs are so ancient that the dignity evidently belonged to a time when Egyptians wore nothing but the girdle of the Negro. Then there's a man by the name of Sir Richard Francis Burton. In 1883, he writes back to Gerald Massey. He basically responds to what Gerald Massey states in his book, Egypt, the Light of the World. He says, "You are quite right about the African origin of the Egyptians. I have 100 human skulls to prove it." So he went into Egypt and he found 100 human skulls, confirming the African origins of the ancient Egyptians. That this is empirical evidence, complete evidence that the original pharaohs of Egypt are black, and that the original people of Egypt are black. Coming out of the south, coming up out of, the Sudan, mainly, the southern region of Sudan. So he found 100 African skulls, proving the origin of the ancient Egyptians. There's another Egyptologist, further proof. There's an Egyptologist by the name of Stuart Smith Tyson, who also, in his studies, he described that from an American standpoint, that the ancient Egyptians would be considered as black in his writings. There's a scientist by the name of R.T. Pritchett. He says that in many of their complexions and many of their complexities, the Egyptians were of an African race. And there's another historian by the name of Gaston Maspero, possibly around the 1800s. He says this. He says, by the unanimous testimonies of the ancient historians, the Egyptians, belong to an African race that first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile. So he's basing this conclusion based off of the ancient historians, the eyewitnesses that saw them, that they were of an African race, based off of the testimonies of the ancient Egyptians, the testimonies of the Greeks. And even there was a Latin historian by the name of Amilicus, and he says this about the ancient Egyptians. He says, because he saw them, he said that the men of Egypt are mostly brown and black with a skinny, desiccant look. Now, there have been a lot of myths surrounding the ancient Egyptians' ethnicity. Okay? There are some that try to say it was some deposit from Southwest Asia, the region that's called the quote-unquote Middle East. You have some that go ahead and try to say that they were Indo-Europeans. We know that that's wrong. Science does not attest to that. History doesn't attest to that. Now, a part of the controversy is this. Some of the artwork of the ancient Egyptian, they use different colors. So sometimes you'll see the men depicted with the color red, and you'll see women sometimes depicted with a tan color or a yellow color to represent fertility, and also to represent a woman's placed besides a man. And so sometimes the man will be depicted as red to represent the blood of life concept in ancient Kemet, what the Greeks renamed Egypt. And so what Count Constantine de Volney was stating when he says that, when he describes the Sphinx as being typically Negro in all of its features, that when he looked at that Sphinx, when he looked at the head of the Sphinx, what the Greeks called the Sphinx, the true name, the true African name of it would be Haramakhet, you know. But when he looked at the face of the Sphinx, he described it as being typically Negro. He knew, he looked at it, he knew he was looking at the face of a black man. The wide nose, the thick lips, the overall profile of the face, that this was definitely the face of an African. This was definitely the face of a black man. Same thing with Vivant Dinan. You know, when he describes in his writings that the Sphinx is gracious and tranquil, that's how it made him feel when he looked at it. Then he goes on to say that the character is African. So we have evidence to show very clearly that the ancient Egyptians are black, that the true indigenous Egyptians are black, and that in its origins and in its origination, that it was definitely a civilization that is autochthonous or indigenous to Africa.
I want you to touch on like the people that basically are disputing that Egyptians are not black, that they believe that they're white. I want you to touch on that really quick.
Okay.
How much time we got? Yeah. Can you touch on that really quick? Just like in terms of...
I'm trying to figure out what direction to go, because like a lot of Americans don't think that they were black. I would say like fake, what you mean, like to get into some of the fake artifacts and stuff?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Yes, there are a number of fraudulent, artifacts that have been, to try to hide the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptian. There's been many, fake artifacts. There've been all kind of paint, that different groups have gone into Egypt or Kemet to scrub some of the dark brown paint off of them. Many of times when you look at the artwork, you can tell that they're definitely black because, again, they had two different types of artwork. They had symbolic artwork where they would use an array of different colors to portray themselves symbolically, such as the blood of life concept. Sometimes they would use the color white to represent purity, to represent when somebody died. Then many of times they would wear wigs. So sometimes the men are depicted in a natural flesh color, and sometimes women are depicted with yellow or gold. Sometimes gold represent the power of the sun. And so sometimes the ancient Egyptian would use even more colors than the Nubians would use in terms of their hieroglyphic depictions of themselves. So yeah, there's definitely a group of racist Eurocentrics that are always trying to figure out how to deduct from the greatness of ancient Africa and trying to figure out a way to put Europeans in a historical position that they were not in. We have all kinds of information to show the truth. But there are those out there that are constantly trying to deduct from what ancient Africa was.
What do you want to gain out of educating people about the origin of Egyptians?
Well, it's educational. We have all kinds of movies that get it wrong, so to speak, that don't portray them in their essence, that don't portray the ancient Egyptian in its true blackness and its true Africanness. They literally call themselves KMT or Kemt or Kemet. Kemet Nu, which translates as the Black Nation, or Kemet Tu, meaning the black people. They literally call themselves, all these different names, Cam and Kim, calling themselves black people, call them the Kemites, and so even here, we have this word here, Kemite. This word Kim, you can spell it like this, of course, means black. And so it means black. And the suffix ite means people or people of. So they literally would call themselves Kemite, people of black, or literally black people. Same thing with the people that they came from. Because again, even in their own writings, they tell you they came from the South. Diodorus Siculus, in his Greek writings, he tells you that the ancient Egyptian is but a colony of the Ethiopians or Cushites. See, the term Ethiopians and Cushites means the same thing. So this word Cush in Hebrew means black. The suffix ites, people. Same thing, they call themselves black people, Kemite, Cushite. They call themselves black people. Okay, so the reason how it became a controversy is just like what Count Constantine de Beauharnais stated between the time of 1787 and 1791, where he describes just to think this race of black men today are slaves and the object of our scorn is the same race to which we owe our arts, our sciences, and even the use of speech. So black people were the object of scorn. Black men were the object of scorn. Okay? And so, being called the N-word, being shackled and treated as cattle. You understand? And so they didn't want it to be known that the very people that they had picking cotton and picking their tobacco were really the true architects of civilization, of human civilization. Because you don't praise your slaves. You don't say things that are good about your slaves, about the people that you enslaved. You understand? And so in order for slavery to work, they didn't want anything to be shown that debunked their lies, that debunked this false notion of European superiority and black inferiority, white supremacy and black inferiority. They didn't want anything that could contradict that. So Egypt, in their mind, was the biggest thing that did that. But really, the whole continent of Africa, the whole history of Africa debunks that lie from the Western world of black inferiority and white supremacy.
All right. Malcolm actually had said something interesting the other day to me about the N-word. You want to tell him?
Okay, just like, so I guess we were talking about like, what's appropriate use of the N-word?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And it's just like, what's the origin of it? What's the origin of the word? And it being Nagas.
Nagas, I heard that before.
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't know if you wanted to like expound upon that or just, we basically were talking about, okay, if nigger is the derogatory or demeaning, you know what I'm saying, and Nagas is the origin and it means king.
King, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then, it's just that play on words. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like, at first we were talking about how nigga is like, black people trying to basically kind of reverse psychology and take back ownership.
Right.
So what do you think on that context?
I mean, people talk how they, how they're going to talk. Mm-hmm. As far as, this is going to be an outtake, right?
Yeah, this is fine.
Yeah, basically, the way I see it, I know people talk how they talk, but I think that, because it also comes from the word Niger, which means black, and it's a river in Western Africa, and it's a country in Africa called Niger, and so Niger really means black, and so basically it is a derogatory word. Nigger is a derogatory term to demean and to degrade black people, and so I think that we of course should be very careful, with what we say,
Okay, that was good.
Or make a distinction between, if we're going to use Nagas or Negus or Niger or Naya, you know, or whatever, you know, make sure we distinguish that from, you know, because a lot of times if it's wrong or not, a lot of times is the intention. So Nigger, the intention behind that is evil. But I understand some people will use it to kind of, you know, Nigga to play around with each other or, you know, or whatever. But like I said, we got to be careful on, you know, what we say.
Now, the way he was breaking down Nagas was basically, my understanding, he said that basically in Africa, primarily North Africa, they would call each other Nagas, like basically calling each other king, queen. And then when people, the settlers came and took slaves, they basically misunderstood the word. So they would call us Nagas, but then it slowly started to became niggers, you know, and it started to become a negative term. But originally it was a positive term that was used for to call someone like, you know, a lord or a king or a person in power.
Absolutely.
What do you think about that? Like in terms of like if could we use the word in terms of like Nagas and as a term of endearment or?
Well, that's what I was saying. I mean, Negus and Nigas, I mean, calling each other kings and you know all that. That's not bad. But if we take on the racism of those that have oppressed our ancestors, I think that's wrong. But like I said, it also goes back to the intention of who's saying it and the reasons why. You know, what's the reason behind them using Nigga is, you know, brotherly, in a brotherly fashion or in a fashion that is, you know, joking or what have you. Okay. So in the northern region of Kemet, some of the Africans have more narrow facial features, more thinner lips, and more narrow profile in a certain region of the north of Africa, in the northern region of Kemet, prior to the invasions. And so the broader facial features, the more Negroid facial features, if you will, more Africoid facial features, the broader nose, the thick lips, that coming from Homo ergaster and his descendant Homo erectus, these are still very broad facial features coming up from the south, which are the original. They're the prototype of humanity, the prototype African facial features, prototype for humanity. And there was a geneticist by the name of Constantine Gloger, and he wrote Gloger's Law. And Shenkanta Diop, or Shenkanta Diop, studied Gloger's Law. And Gloger's Law teaches that organisms start off dark and become lighter in pigmentation and complexion and in melanin. And so Diop found out that this actually applies also to human beings. That in a warm climate, you have dark skin. In a colder climate, you have a white complexion or become lighter gradually over time. And so Gloger's Law teaches this, that the first human beings were completely homogeneous, meaning that they were the same throughout, and completely Negroid in their racial and ethnic appearance, talking about the way that they looked. And that the broadest facial features, the more Negroid facial features, are the prototype for humanity and the prototype for Africans, and therefore the prototype of humans. But in Egypt, as pockets of the descendants of Ham, which, you know, still carried the Homo ergaster stock or Homo erectus stock as well, which is a descendant of Homo ergaster, pockets of them begin to migrate north and begin to have slightly narrow profile. So you have ancient Egyptians that have even broader facial features than some of the modern people in Africa, and some, you know, have a more thinner profile in the northern region.
Dope. In terms of like facial features, what is it that they had in common with then from the bodies that they discovered, the fossils that they discovered, to us now? What are some of the facial features that would directly relate to an African American in?
Well, there was a study called Smith 2005 that studies the limb proportions or the body proportions of the ancient Egyptians, and there have been other studies that shows that African Americans and tropically adapted Africans have the same type of skeletal structure as an ancient Egyptian. Same type of skeletal structure, Negroid, Africoid, if you will, Afroid, these different terms. But as far as, wide nostrils, thick lips, more broader features, that is the original. And so this begins to change with different pockets of people migrating into other parts of the world, going back to the origin of man. Up in Europe, due to a cold climate, the Africans that migrate up into Europe, what scientists would call Homo neanderthalensis. He and his descendants, again, originally still black, originally still Negroid upon leaving Africa. And so still very broad facial features, very dark skin. They got facial reconstructions of what they look like. And so what ends up happening due to the cold climate in Europe, there's a process of demyelination that begins to occur with these different pockets of Africans that migrate into Europe. And so the Homo neanderthalensis and his descendants begin to transform. They begin to become demyelinated, and through a genetic adaptation due to a cold climate. And scientists refer to this process of becoming demyelinated as a genetic change called OCA2. OCA2. So this is a genetic change. And this is where you begin to have the Africans that migrate up out of Africa into the northern hemisphere, going all the way up into Europe, and begin to have blue eyes. And gradually over time, they begin to transform out of their Negroid or sub-Saharan description due to OCA2, which leads to blue eyes. And so there was a documentary entitled The Black Swedes. And what, Donald Trump, he calls the African nations SHIT holes and compares them with Sweden. But see, this documentary entitled The Black Swedes talks about how the original people in Sweden were black. They were dark-skinned, Negroid, sub-Saharan Africans that began to, hunter-gatherer groups that began to sprout blue eyes. So pockets of them, moving around in different places would go through this process of OCA2. Sprouting blue eyes, because blue eyes were that process of becoming demyelinated. And eventually the skin complexion will become less melanated. So they will go from being a Negroid African with woolly hair and very big facial features to simply being dark skinned. The facial features begin to change. Some of them began to have a more narrow profile, a more narrow nose, because up in the cold climate, there's no longer a need for wide nostrils, because the people of Africa, the children of Africa, being Negroid, if you will, or Africoid, there was a need for woolly hair to dissipate heat, a need for wide nostrils, a need for full lips. Because of the hot environment, you want to dissipate heat. It was a need for very dark skin, that melanin protected from the light of the sun. as opposed to up in Europe, they have vitamin D. As they began to become demelanated and go from being negroid and simply to being dark skinned and eventually becoming white. And that process of becoming what we now call white or European, Indo-European, having white skin, blonde hair, red hair, green eyes, blue eyes, as a result of OCA2, because originally all people on the planet had dark brown eyes or black eyes, same eye color as all the native people of Africa. So it's important to note that 200,000 years ago, everybody on the planet was black. On every continent. Europe, Asia, East Asia, Korea, the region, the so-called Middle East, everybody on the planet was black. And one of the main ways we know that, Yale University came out with a scientific article around 2009 entitled, "We Are All Africans." Okay? And in this article, the scientists at Yale University, they did a genetic analysis of the Y chromosome, the human Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. Men have the Y chromosomal DNA, women have mitochondrial DNA. And all of it is of an African origin. So everybody on the planet, going back over 200,000 years ago, our modern heritage to going back to what scientists call the genetic atom, over 200,000 years ago, everybody on this planet was black. Scientific evidence. And also, National Geographic also did a genetic analysis of the Y chromosome. And we also have the term chromosome here. So, this is the prefix here. This word chromo, color. Pigment, color and pigmentation. That's what chromo is in the classical Greek. And this word somes, genetic structures. That's what somes are. Ribosomes. Somes are genetic structures. This is suffix. So chromosomes are color, pigmentation, genetic structures. That's what chromosomes are. Because chromo in the classical Greek means color / pigmentation, and somes are genetic structures. The prefix is chromo, and also you can say also in the classical Greek, chroma. It means the same thing. It's chromo and chroma, color and pigmentation, melanin, somes, genetic structures. Relating back to over 200,000 years ago of human history, in that the facial reconstruction of the genetic atom gives us a glimpse of the original human being in the Garden of Eden, what they would have looked like, the Y chromosomal genetic atom and the mitochondrial Eve. This is very important. And hence that all people on every continent over 200,000 years ago were black. And even in the Yale University article it states that it's something that everybody needs to accept, that we are all black. Everybody's black. Coming from dark-skinned Africans, migrating into other continents, Europe, Asia, and becoming depigmented through that genetic process, OCA2. What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Big Chris, Christian Pace, and I'm here with our good brother Dana Stevens. Just gonna be here chopping up some good game, giving all praises due to the Most High Yahweh and His Son Yahshua, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you having me down here, Big C, and I'm looking forward to learning, as I already have tonight, some stuff that is in you. So
All praises due to the Most High. That's where the wisdom
try to grasp
comes.
it all up in here.
Yeah, it's just the wisdom of the Most High that He's been building.
And He has wisdom. He has wisdom.
Absolutely.
Trust me on that one. Wow.
Yes, yes. Praise Yahweh. So, the first thing, as we already know, once again in these United States, the topic of race has come up again in a very disturbing and derogatory type of way, with all these different things. This insurrection that just recently happened, January the 6th.
Yeah.
They're still talking about it a whole lot in the media. Such a grand event within the context of the United States of these two evil concepts, white supremacy and also black inferiority, and that overall association with blackness with savagery going all the way back to the early 15th century, 16th century, of the savage African running naked in the jungle, people thinking that black people haven't done anything historically relevant, and just associating the entire, not just the color, because people talk about color all the time, but it's associating our entire phenotype with being savage.
Right.
The entire what we would call sub-Saharan African descent, Ethiopian, Kushite, Kemite, Cushitic, Negroid, Africoid, whatever you want to call it, that phenotype specifically was savagery. So I just want to take the time to sort of debunk some of these myths and things that have been going on, for a very long time, because a lot of these things start in the past. So what we see today, the past is just a prerequisite into the future.
Correct. And I see that not only that belief, coming into the inner city, I learned something that I never dealt with, within us Caucasian people, and that's like, if your skin was darker, you were less handsome or less beautiful, or if your skin was darker toned, you were kind of ostracized even amongst yourselves, and I never understood that at first until it's kind of some of the things that you're saying, is that we've correlated the darker skin with you being an individual that is a savage, an untamed beast. And I have seen that, really manifest itself amongst, our, white, especially our white evangelical family members. Because if President Obama was a man of really dark skin, I definitely do not believe that he would have been president. But because he was so light-skinned, he was at least able to, cross that line and that threshold. But I know you were sharing some things with me even earlier, just how that has all, and the basis of where that came from.
Absolutely. It's lots of historical issues and problems that were a precedence for that. Just associating basically the lighter you are, the closer to white you are as a black person or a person of African descent, the closer to civilization that you are. Now, science, of course, has debunked this. Science, ancient history, biblical studies, true anthropology debunks these lies. News Weekly came out with a whole article talking about how specifically dark-skinned black Africans, as they're called, but dark-skinned indigenous African people, specifically having dark skin, ranging from a dark brown, richly melanated, such as myself, ranging from my color all the way to a literal black skin complexion, were the ones who created the first human monarchy, within ancient Sudan, ancient Kush, Ethiopia, that Central East African region of Uganda and Kenya, Tanzania, that entire Southeast Africa, Central Africa region, what we would call the Great Lakes region. Okay. And then, because the Nile flows from south to north, as I've covered in a previous lesson, so you can actually take the Nile to flow north.
Right. I mean, even just what we have taught in. I went to Moody Bible Institute, and I mean the story of Moses with, in Egypt and all of that. I mean, let's look at it. Egypt was an incredible empire. It was an incredible civilization. Mm-hmm. Well, who created that? Yeah, the Hebrew slaves maybe helped build, the pyramids and stuff, but yet the Egyptians themselves were people of dark skin, and yet we still marvel at those pyramids to this day. Well, they weren't built by Caucasian individuals. They were, built by people that in America we would, I'm sure, label as savages. Because we took your ancestors to this country, and when we want to be honest, who built a majority of this land, physically, as well as who invented the things that we use today for us to be where we are. Well, it wasn't most of it was not my white evangelical or Caucasian family members. It was your family members.
Yeah, it was a lot of things have been stolen because a lot of the enslaved individuals, which were my ancestors, weren't able to get patents on their inventions and whatnot, and so a lot of things were stolen. Right. And so I remember on YouTube you read off a list. Yeah. And one of the first things on that list was the creation of civilization, the creation of the alphabet. And I've already gone over in a previous lesson about the original language being proto-syllabus, being a pictorial language created by what scientists refer to as Homo ergaster. But before that, his predecessor was Australopithecus. So specifically before Homo ergaster is Homo habilis, and then Australopithecus and his subspecies Australopithecus robustus. And so the beginnings of human civilization, the beginnings of writing and architecture and speech comes out of Africa. Yeah. Comes from African people. And so Australopithecus was very hairy, being up in the trees. And, the ancient Africans would mimic nature, mimic what they saw the animals doing. And so quite possibly Australopithecus may not have been able to move his thumbs. But eventually, as he becomes Homo ergaster, which translates as working man, and then his descendant, which is Homo erectus, which is they're standing upright at this point. They're no longer quite hairy and slouched over. So I believe personally that's where that whole association with black people and monkeys sort of came about.
Yeah, because and I do know the only time that growing up in the, well, they call it an education system here in the United States, but it's actually an indoctrination, because we do not educate truth, especially when it comes to you and your family members. But anytime I would see images of the caveman, almost what you're explaining now, we just saw it as the caveman. You did see the first one, kind of a guy that was more bent over, and then every picture he became straightened more up, and then his facial features became less monkey looking, and the hair became less, and I do believe that is. And see, this is the thing that don't make any sense. So if we're going to consider you as men and women of black, dark skin, as savages or as the caveman, then why do we believe that white people started civilization then too?
Exactly.
You know, the two don't go together.
Exactly. And the thing is, as I've discussed with you before, the original cavemen were dark skinned. They were Negroid, sub-Saharan African, Ethiopic, Negroid peoples that went upon going into the ice, they begin to lose that melanin.
Right. Up into the Cascade,
Absolutely.
Caucasus Mountains, and then and we know that
What
because
scientists refer to as homo neanderthalensis.
yeah. Yeah, and even in my, you know, I'm Norwegian mostly, and so, you know, when you look at the climate in Norway, you know, and in the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Finland, and up there, Denmark, you know, even during the summer, you know, the highs are only maybe 70. And so, you know, there's a reason why I look the way that I look, and there's a reason why I still, in this revelation that I've come into, that you and your ancestors are the true chosen people of the Most High Yah, is there's no way that this skin that I'm wearing would be able to handle 12, 14, 16 hours in an Egyptian sun. You know, and that reminds me, even as we, you know, think about the Ashkenazi Jews, the white Jews that we see today that are claiming to be, you know, that people. How I would just really like to know what did they use to keep themselves from getting skin cancer, because the reality is when you look at skin cancer amongst people groups, the Ashkenazi Jews in Israel today are the second leading nation or group of people with melanoma skin cancer. The first group of people are the Australians, but yet when you think of white Australians, that wasn't their, you know, home territory or land.
Yeah, the Aborigines.
The Aborigines, they took it from them, and the Aborigines are people of darker skin. So that in of itself, you know, like my grandpa always told me, you know, God knew what he was doing when he created creation, because he put creation where creation needed to be to survive the elements or the weather that was around it. So it's just my white Caucasian family members, it's just their unwillingness to even look at some of this simple truth and not yet just take a step back to say, well, you know what, there is some truth there. How did we survive? How did this? Why is this? But it goes back to that main issue.
Yeah,
is
the miseducation.
The miseducation, the indoctrination, and then the white supremacy that we have taught all these years that we are the supreme race. We have taught all these years that God has ordained us to be the supreme race. That's why he's given us the gospel, and that's why the United States is sending out all these missionaries across the globe so that we can, you know, if it's a word, unsavage, you know, or at least colonize, you know, all of the savages, you know, in Africa and across the world that are people of dark skin.
Yeah, because see, in Africa, the civilization started in the southeastern and also in the west and going into the Congo, and also down towards South Africa, Central Africa, the western region of South Africa, and also the Congo. That's where you find some of the most ancient forms of speech and vocabulary, sense formation and syntax. And so these civilizations were being brought down the Nile, you know, because the Nile flows from the south into the north. So these civilizations were being built from the south. And so when we look at the tomb of Ramesses III, you see a depiction of 4 individuals. You see the ancient Egyptian portrayed phenotypically as being black. You see the Indo-European. You see the letter C as the other blacks in Africa. And then you have D, which is the Semite. So what you see is, C is the oldest one on the list, because he even leads to the Egyptian. And so they both have the same style of clothing.
Like I told you guys, this is a man filled with wisdom, you know. And then the bottom truth is this: the Bible even declares that when he created Adam, he took the dirt. You know, let's just get to that, God's word. You know, he took the word, or the dirt, and he formed man. You know, so either dirt was white at that time, or when he took the brown dirt or the black dirt and created man, he must have then all of a sudden changed them white. But you know, the reality is also that, you know, our black females are the only human species, human person that has all the, I believe it's all the chromosomes and
Yeah, Homo erectus had all of the genetics that would lead to that, even though Homo erectus himself still looking like Homo ergaster, ranging from dark brown, that richly brown color like I do, ranging from a literal black skin complexion. Homo erectus had the genetics to eventually produce light skin and eventually white skin upon migrating out of Africa between 40 and 60,000 years ago.
Yep. And we see it, you know, we were talking earlier tonight too, there is two kinds of evolution. You have macro evolution, you have micro evolution. And tonight what, you know, we're really talking about is that form of microevolution.
Absolutely.
And we see it in our animals. Like I said, you know, I grew up in Minnesota, I live up in the north. And you always saw the robins, you know, gathering together in the fall and heading south before the cold weather came. But even in my 49 years, I now see several robins, you know, more than just a handful, sticking around throughout the whole winter. Because obviously there's been some micro-evolution in them that they've adapted to our winter cold climate. And therefore, there's no need for them to go south anymore.
Absolutely.
So, and even in school, we were taught just like the height of man. You know, even in the United States, it used to be the average height was like 5'8" or 9. Now the average height is like 5'11" or something. So, so you know, all of this just shows, you know, that you know, we all arrived from the same person, but just because we spread out, you know, it has caused our skin to be different, and then we've turned our white skin into something being more supreme or superior over yours, and we're the educated, we're the civilized people, and you know, even what we talked about and what you're sharing, because of that, you're the savage.
But that's what they've been teaching. That's the falsehood of white supremacy has spun this thing around. And so the reason why they did that back in the 1500s, early 15th, 16th, 17th century, all the way up until now, is because they created that narrative of a savage African during slavery. You know, and they would have all these ugly cartoons, and it would, you know, caricatures with big pink lips, you know,
and, scary looking.
And the reason why they would do that so-called Sambo imagery is because you don't appraise your slave. You don't, just like what Dr. Theophilo Banga says, you don't say good things about your slave. So you don't say, well, you're my slave, but you taught me civilization. You're my slave, but you taught me how to speak. You know, or what Count Constantine de Beauharnais stated between 1787 and 1791, just to think that this race of black men today are slaves and the object of our scorn is the same race to which we owe our arts, our sciences, and even the use of speech. And so that's where it comes from. And I believe there's even a jealousy. There's a
fear of it and a jealousy.
But it's like white supremacy as a spirit and as a concept. It's like that amateur basketball player just claiming to be better than Michael Jordan, claiming to be superior to Michael Jordan. But when he actually gets a time to play Michael Jordan,
the reality comes out.
Absolutely.
The truth comes out. And see, we're doing everything. I shouldn't, you know, I say we, but I'm saying, you know, my white Caucasian family members, we're doing everything from that happening. Because we do know that if the playing field was equal, you trample all over us. And when I say trample, I don't mean that as a negative, you know, we're going to defeat you. I'm just talking about we see it in sports. Okay, we in the areas where we have allowed you to succeed, and I believe that white America has allowed you to succeed, specifically like in sports and in entertainment arenas with like music and stuff, because that brings us pleasure, and it also brings us money, because we still own you, we still own the systems. So in those two arenas, it's been made very clear and obvious that you are talented or have ability on an average way above us. And because we see it there, I do believe that there is a fear and there is a jealousy. There is a jealousy of that, but then there is a fear, and so that fear, even though we are not educated on the facts that, there's how many inventions, but one of them, even the car, we give honor to Henry Ford for the car, and this is kind of ironic, but Henry Ford, according to my grandpa, and I do have the papers at home, he is like my great 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 uncle. But the reality is Henry Ford got credit for the car, but it was a black man that actually did the final fine tunings of what he needed to do to make it a car. So, the more, and I think that's why you're seeing more and more fear and jealousy amongst my white Caucasian family members, is because with the internet, with social media, and the movies that are starting to come out, true movies, you're seeing the reality of the gifting and the abilities that lie within you and your family members, our black family members in this country, and that's something that is starting to cause us to have to get on the same playing field, and we're in trouble.
So yeah, during slavery, like kind of like we've just been talking about here, is that there were different things that were stolen. Jack Daniel's beer, or his whiskey rather, was one of those things. And there was a enslaved person, an enslaved black man by the name of Nearest Green, that was really doing all the distillery that he took from that Jack Daniel owning Nearest Green, stole his recipe. And so now everybody's calling it Jack Daniel's whiskey when he really took it from Nearest Green. So there's been a lot of different things that have been stolen.
Right. And that's the biggest thing, like when white America wants to say, well, I never owned a slave, why do I need to, pay for something that I never did, maybe my great great ancestors did. But what you're just sharing with that one example of probably millions of other examples is a reason why white America needs to pay their debt. Because we are still benefiting every day of our lives off the backs of your ancestors, not just from the physical labor. We think that slavery was just out in the fields picking cotton. No, that was a part of the slavery, but taking the inventions, taking the even Elvis Presley. When you look at Elvis Presley, he was huge, amongst the white family members. But when you do your research, you find out that a lot of his music was written by black men and women, because again, they weren't able to be on the radio, they weren't able to be on TVs, they weren't able to really flourish with their music, and so they sold it or gave it to, or it was taken by individuals such as Elvis Presley. Because there had to be a reason why his music was so different from all the other music that was going on that day. And now, of course, we know the reason why.
Absolutely. And the thing is, even where he studied a lot of his dance moves and got a lot of his styles from, predominantly black churches.
Yep.
Where he studied the music, he studied the sound of the music.
And I think Michael Jackson was, I think at one point he married his daughter, but again, Michael Jackson was involved with Elvis Presley when Michael was young, which
days.
yeah.
And even like a lot of the beginnings of American music, a lot of what we call American music is black music.
Yeah.
You know, because you even had this young black girl who was scared of racism going to a country concert, you know, with the Confederate flags and all these other different things. But a lot of the roots of country music and bluegrass and all of that, rock and roll, all of it comes out of black music. A lot of it is just different derivatives of R&B, you know.
And that it always amazes me how I remember some years ago when it was the big word and the big discussions in the education system was around Ebonics, you know, and we contributed this lack of proper speaking and language to, you know, our black young men speaking this Ebonics inappropriate or not appropriate language. And yet today, it's embraced 24/7, you know, 365. You know, when we text, a lot of it is in Ebonics. And so once white culture embraces it, it becomes a positive. And then all of a sudden, it's us. But it was invented by you. It was degraded until we embraced it, found a need for it, and then it becomes something that is spectacular. And then again, all the glory goes to us.
Yeah, and that's one of the functionings of white supremacy, is to erase anything relevant or deduct any relevancy or any greatness from black people.
Yeah.
Because the purpose of that is to trample on. See, white supremacy is about trampling on anything black, anything African, so I can get ahead. That's the mentality of it.
Yep.
But they run into a huge problem because we now know scientifically there's a man by the name of Albert Perry, and scientists have found that he's an African American man, and he has the most ancient Y chromosome in the world.
Wow.
So at a genetic level, people are finding out these different things. You know, these scientists, these anthropologists, these archaeologists are finding out so much about black DNA, ancient black history, different artifacts that have been found all over the world. Statues with thick lips and wide nostrils and braids and dreadlocks and afros, you know, and just braids coming down and all of this stuff. Statues painted dark brown and black.
Even the original Madonna.
Yeah.
You know, and then I do know like a lot of the stone statues and figures that we have seen, you know, especially in the time of the Egyptians and stuff. One of the things that we did to try to distort who you really were was break off the noses, you know, so they didn't have the more of the what we would traditionally call, you know, our black faces or features.
And even now, the Discovery Channel, they've done a reconstruction of King Tut's face.
Yes.
And it's clearly a black man, dark brown skin. We look at King Tut's tomb, and we see the same thing. We see that depiction is definitely on point and on par with so much of the other ancient Egyptian statues of Imhotep, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and all Nefertiti's daughters. You know, all these different ones. We're finding out that these are definitely people of color. Even the facial reconstruction of Cleopatra, that many people have been trying to argue about as well.
And that's why, you know, it says my people perish for a lack of knowledge, and the knowledge that my forefathers have stripped from us is going to cause us to perish, because you know it's you know, as we both know, the season of white superiority, if I want to say that, is coming to an end, and God's mercy, the Most High's mercy, is revealing all the truth that we're talking about, which is really going to, the only reason why anybody would not embrace this truth is simply because
they don't want to.
They don't want to. And
All the excuses will be off the
All
table.
those excuses would be off the table. Even with, you know, people that live in small towns, like growing up, like my mother would used to say, well, you know, living in a small town in southern Minnesota, we didn't really know all this stuff was really this bad going on. So she said, I'm grateful now, not only because I've been living in the inner city, so she's for 27 years has been able to see this, but she says, with all the social media out there, she said there's no reason that anybody will ever have an excuse to say they didn't know of the injustices or they didn't know of the truths that we're talking about. If they say they don't know, it's because they didn't want to know.
Absolutely. And God is making it, the Most High Yahweh is making it very clear,
Very clear.
you know, in these last days, you know, with the like you're saying, the truth about all these injustices, the statistics, the numbers are coming out. Like, I saw something recently on the news where this year, 2021, is following, even with the pandemic and everything, is still following previous years of 2020 and 2019 of young black people being murdered by the cops. It's following that same trend. And we're just in the third month of the year.
No trends can stop. You know, that's why the Bible says what a part of repentance means that you first acknowledge the wrong. You acknowledge the sin. You acknowledge the action or the behavior, the mentality, whatever it is. You acknowledge it, and then once you acknowledge it, then you change from it. But one thing white America has never done is, you know, and now it's being acknowledged on news medias, but as a whole, and especially the white evangelical church, they have never stopped to acknowledge the sin of white supremacy and the injustices that it has dealt. The same way they want to acknowledge the sin of homosexuality or the sin of abortion. You know, if they did, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. We would be, you know, maybe better off. But when you don't acknowledge your sin of injustice and white supremacy, you're never going to change it.
Absolutely. And it's the brainwashing that is taking place, because it's some of the two main weapons of white supremacy is false history. It's a falsification of history, fake information, fake anthropology, incorrect information. Also false images, you know, very Eurocentric imagery.
Like Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
You know, long hair, blue eyes.
The pictures
you know.
of Jesus, yeah.
And so when white evangelical missionaries took that image across the globe, they automatically began to set up white superiority.
Yeah, and
Because
the true artifacts were unshown. They've been hidden.
They've been hidden.
Because when Christianity and Judaism took a detour into Europe, that's what, again, that plus the transatlantic slave trade, it suddenly began a need to try to hide the true images, like you were mentioning, the Black Madonna, because, you know, there's the Pope and there's these different ones all over in a place called Barcelona, Spain, where people come from miles around to pay homage and to pray before a large image of a Black Mary and a Black Jesus painting, you know, all over the world. And so the issue is with black people, particularly Black Americans in particular, is that a lot of our people here had this assumption that these white theologians and these different ones, the white theologians, the American historians and archaeologists, that they wouldn't lie to us. They wouldn't lie. And the thing that was predicated on was the fact that different ones claimed the church, different ones claimed Christianity, different ones claimed to know Jesus and love Jesus. I'm talking about the ones that are theologians. But now we're hearing more and more and more of these white pastors, such as Pastor Kilpatrick in particular, and there have been others that have come out. These white pastors have been coming out more and more, declaring that black people are the true chosen people, and also telling white people to repent. And we're hearing it more and more now.
And just the falseness of the lies that basically have been done to cover up the wickedness of my forefathers, you know, is coming back and is going to destroy this country because, again, I mean, let's look at the insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why the National Guard and all those individuals were there were, number one, those white people weren't going to do nothing bad. You know, they were white people. You know, yeah, they're supremacists, but this is their capital. This is this. So that's why it became. That's why it's going to be such a well-known day in the history of America.
Absolutely.
And it didn't have to get to that point, but it did because never did they think. See, this is why I say that. Going back to even at the beginning of what we were talking about, the reason why I believe that cops will shoot a black man thinking or believing he has a gun or a weapon in his hand is because we're kind of taught, we are taught, and it's not that I sat in a classroom growing up where I was literally taught what I'm about to say. But our society in our indoctrination and removing around the true facts automatically teaches this. That a black person is an animal. Even Willie Lynch, you know, called you wild horses. You know, you are a wild individual until colonization is ingrained in you. Then we tame you. Then we, you know, civilize you. Then you can, in most cases, become a good American citizen. So with that mindset, what happens is when an officer or even a white person sees a person of color, especially a black man, you know, even if they have a comb or anything, their mindset says, you know, you are born a savage, you're born wild, and so shooting you, I'm really not taking that big of a chance in shooting somebody who's civil because you're already a wild person. So maybe 1 out of 10 chances you're civil. So 90% you're not, so I'm going to shoot you. But when you see a white person, it's the opposite. You know, us white people are civil individuals, you know, but maybe 1 out of us in a 10 group may act or turn out to be negative. But see, then again, and you'll see this in the news medias, it's never that person's fault. The first thing they want to do is, that's why they want to keep them alive. See, so that's why, look, you know, you get shot and killed in the back for possibly having a gun, although you're running from the police officer, and yet a white guy can come out of a school after blowing away 18 children and be fine. Because see, what we need to do then is really find out why this white person did what he did. Because that's not how we are. That's how you are until you are colonized, until you are Christianized by us. But we as white people are not that way. So now we have to find out who failed this individual. You know, was it his teachers that knew? Was it his parents that knew? You know, what happened in his life? Who bullied him? Who did this? And who failed to step in before he turned out this way?
Who failed to intervene?
Who failed to intervene? Because that's not how we are. But the truth of the fact is, that is how we are. Because we've done it everywhere we've gone. You know, missionaries across the world, they go, yes, maybe they went with the right intention, but as we were talking earlier, and I think it was a African queen that said that the missionaries came with the Bible, they taught us how to pray, close our eyes, bow our head, and then when we were done praying, we opened up our eyes, and yes, we had the Bible, but then the white Caucasians had the land and the resources and even your lives.
And that goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning about that association with the phenotype. It's not only just the dark skin, because they can put up with an Indian person that's darker skin, they can put up with an Arab person that's darker skin, but it's the blackness, it's the Africanness, that clear blackness, that clear Cushitic, Ethiopian, Africoid, Negroid quote unquote sub-Saharan look that they've totally associated with savagery. And they've associated the Europeans' phenotype with being civil. So the closer that one is to that, the closer to civilization they are. So basically what has happened is the white supremacists have flipped the story around.
Yep.
Because that ideology is way off from the truth.
Yep. I mean, and even today, I mean, I'm taking my family to Africa, my mom and dad to Ghana. And the first question that my mom said that, a lot of, her friends and people around her are like, oh my gosh, you're going to go to Africa? And my mom's like, well, yeah, why? Because in their mind, they're thinking we're going to go and stay in huts. They're like, well, just think, you won't even have, this and this. And it's like, because we still don't even teach that even in Africa today, that they have technology. We don't. And it's not because we teach that you don't have it per se. What the problem is we don't even teach anything that is good that comes out of Africa. And it kind of goes back to like what you're saying. And that's why I'm really excited to take my parents there so that they can see for themselves, just the amount of lies and deception that has been specifically taught to us regarding
in the West.
Yes.
And it's a level of ignorance that has purposefully been ingrained
That's right.
into the society for the maintenance of the falsehood that is white supremacy, and also the falsehood that is black inferiority. Yep. Where you have a lot of people pushing this ideology, black and white, because white supremacy is a demonic spirit. It's an unclean spirit. And it's not only inside of white people, it's also in black people. It's also inside of a Candace Owens and a Larry Elder and these different ones that they may have wisdom at their craft in terms of work skills or whatever, but they have a severe ignorance due to living in the United States and being fed the trash that is white supremacy, the falsehood that is white supremacy. So that's what's been done.
Or to even think that Candace Owens and others like her, because you talk proper white English and because you even stand up against your own, that you're going to be embraced. White supremacy will never embrace you.
That's right.
We laugh at you.
That's right.
Because you're nothing but a pawn.
That's right.
In our hand. And they have no respect. My people have no respect for you at all. And then we only use you as an example to then that much more judge, others, to be like, well, look at Candace, or, look at this. Because see, white culture is really good at this. And this is, I saw real quickly how my white evangelicals cannot handle the way that they stereotype and grouply judge everybody else. So you can look at a black man out on the street that obviously, let's say, he looks like he's in drugs and he's a gang member, whatever it might be. Now all of a sudden, that's your perception of black men. Anytime you see a black man come, that's your perception. But how they hate when I look at these white supremacists that had "We Love Jesus" flags, John 3:16 flags on the day of insurrection. When I say to them, well, look at you people. Look at all you evangelicals. Look at you people. Well, don't you put me in that. I wasn't there. Don't you put... So all of a sudden now individuality is so important to you. But when it comes to our black brothers and sisters, individuality is nowhere to be found.
Absolutely.
You judge everybody based off of the one person, and then you don't even know the true story behind that one person, because if you did, you would find out that, the person that you think is so bad, it's actually the society, because it goes back to this. We have to create a society that always maintains and sustains the image that you are a savage beast until you submit and bow down to white Christianity and the colonization that we have brought to you. That's why even in the church, I would always ask, with the slavery, finally, one of the professors at Moody Bible Institute told me, and he said, well, Dana, he said, at least blacks should be grateful for this aspect of slavery, that we brought them the gospel. And I was like, now we can see how much of a lie that is, because the gospel actually originated in you.
Yeah, and the thing is, what gospel were they bringing? It was a twisted gospel.
Twisted gospel?
Of white supremacy.
That's right.
And they were trying to subjugate another group of people.
That's right.
With a fake Jesus, and the Bible talks about that. In the latter days, people worshiping another Jesus and believing in another gospel, and so that's what's going on here. And that ties in even with that insurrection, where you had all these guys, because when they were at Mike Pence's dais, they did a prayer. The white supremacists that had gone in there, they had did a prayer at Mike Pence's dais. And then you see the white police officer kind of standing there calmly conversating with them a little bit, trying to tell them to back up a little bit, but then he's still very calm and collected when dealing with them. I don't know if it was out of fear or white supremacy or white privilege or a little bit of combination of all three of those things. But, which I believe the latter.
Or maybe he even agreed with some of it too, and so he was like,
that's what I'm saying.
Hey, but I better, because I'm a cop, I better show him that I'm trying to,
But they did this whole prayer, and they also smeared feces while they were inside of the building. The insurrectionists were urinating. A lot of people don't know, but a lot of white supremacists are also Satanists. And that's why, Timothy McVeigh, when he did the Oklahoma City bombing, he had the sigil of Baphomet, or the goat of Mendez, on his jacket, when he did that crime. And so, what I heard in the spirit was defiling of a temple. That's what, that's what they were doing when they were in there. They wanted to defile that capital, claiming that it's theirs. Even though the brick and the mortar of that building was built by the slaves, built by my ancestors being enslaved in this country. In early American architecture was built by the slaves.
Yeah.
There's a man by the name of Horace King who was responsible for drawing up a lot of these different buildings and everything, and a lot of it was built by the slaves. Early government buildings here in the United States.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the TV show Good Times.
Okay.
So you familiar with that area?
I am.
Chicago.
Good. Yeah, I watched Good Times growing up when I was young in southern Minnesota, and then I went to Moody Bible Institute, which is pretty much downtown Chicago, and literally 2 blocks away, if that, was a project, and that was Cabrini Green. And that is the project where this movie Good Times was filmed from. So while at Moody, they had a program called Big Brother Big Sister, and so I ended up kind of adopting a young man, Reginald, from Cabrini Green. He was in one of the high rises, and so I made my way over there on a regular basis, almost weekly. For probably 2.5 years. I actually stayed in one of the townhomes in Cabrini Green for about 1.5 months during one of the summers that I did not go home, and I stayed in Chicago. And today now, it's been probably about 15 years ago, 12 years ago, they started demolishing Cabrini Green, because their purpose was to build one of the things that they found that helps not just the poor but also the rich is having them kind of dwell together. So then the rich can become a little bit more empathetic of the hardships of being poor, and then as well, then the poor can have people around them that might help positively influence them, on life. So, I mean, the concept sounds like, yes, that could work. You and I know that the issues with, especially our black poor, isn't because of laziness and a unwillingness to work. It's because we have a society that has created that type of, mindset, if you want to say. But anyway, making a long story short, today is pretty much all gone, and now it's, $1 million townhomes and apartments that have been built in its place. But you know, I just remember when I would go over there, the city wouldn't even have enough money to fix the swing sets
Wow.
on the playground. And now today, like I said, you've got a fountain that they probably spent $500,000 to, you know,
Interesting.
to put there to mark this great new neighborhood. But then there was Walter Payton High School was built, and that was supposed to be the high school where the residents within this now new created community, where Cabrini Green was, would be able to go to school together.
Wow.
Well, after about 2 to 4 weeks of the residents that were removed from Cabrini Green because they were tearing down the property, were kicked out of the hotels. The city was going to pay for it. They kicked them out of the hotels, and a lot of them then ventured to the south side of Chicago, wherever they could, to find housing, and you know, never lived up to the promise of what they said they were going to do. So I just share that story because it just shows again just the depth of injustice.
Wow.
But I know at one time you and I were talking, because I remember specifically the episode, and it was wasn't JJ, but it was his brother.
Yeah.
I just lost his name.
The very young.
Yeah, the young one. He started getting involved, I believe, with Black Power or some type of group at school. And one of the things that he learned in this group was, you know, the falseness of the white Jesus. And you know, in the home of the family, there was an image of Jesus, you know, right there, and he was the European created image, and that just, you know, I guess that does two things to me. It makes me angry because of the lies and the purposeful lies and the purposefulness of that deception that we did in creating this white Jesus to make us look superior, you inferior. But on the other side, it also shows me just how incredible of a group of individuals you guys are.
Wow.
That the same image of the Messiah, of that you know, of us, that was enslaving and oppressing you and everything we kind of been talking about, you still would bow down and worship that and give your life to that Messiah. And I just know that there's no way, and you're seeing it now, there's no way that my white evangelicals who say they are sold out and love God, 90% of them or more would never bow down to the real, you know, image of Christ according to the Bible, which we know it says that he had hair as white as wool, which doesn't come from me, and skin that would be like bronzed, that was like in the furnace, so which is not like me. And just to think though that you were still willing, and that shows me your dedication to God, which also backs up my absolute belief that you are the true chosen people, because you still had a desire to serve that God.
And the thing is that a lot of people, they get into this, well, what does it matter? You know, they start with that, you know, that famous line of what does it matter, what difference does it make? You know, what color Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ the Messiah, they get into that, what does it matter, what difference does it make? But then yet and still, here are all these lies, here are all these deception. If it really didn't matter,
What make him the right color.
Exactly. Why is he portrayed incorrectly? Why is the black origins and the African influence that was clearly there been kicked to the side?
That's right.
Because the Bible talks about take the child and flee into Egypt.
Yeah.
So he was hiding amongst the Hamites,
Right.
the Africans. And so he himself looked like those people.
He had to, otherwise he would have been found.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it does matter, because again, if it doesn't matter, then at least acknowledge the falsehood of the image you have in your churches. Now, if you decide you want to keep him up there, that's on you. But at least acknowledge and speak the truth that this image here is not correct. But we're going to keep it here anyway.
And the thing is, they say that it doesn't matter, but why all the stereotyping, why all the derogatory images in the media where you got black people, young black girls twerking and booty shaking and thug imagery, gangster imagery, savage imagery, all these evil things that are meant to push the false ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority. And a lot of people say that the color doesn't matter, it's just the authenticity that you have in the belief.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is, if you really have an authenticity in the belief, then you would accept the fact that that he was black, because like we were saying, it's either Jesus Christ, you either accept Jesus Christ all,
Yep. Or not
or
at
you
all.
don't accept him at all.
And my white evangelicals that want to say that color doesn't matter, I'll go to this far and say, okay, it really doesn't. But what does matter is what lies in your heart. When
Wow.
God looks at what you think about or feel about somebody who's black, that's what matters.
In the hatred that they have,
The
in their heart.
hatred and that's in their heart. So, right, God, I don't believe God would send me to hell because, he was a certain color, this and that. And I'll play that little game with them.
Mm-hmm.
But what he's going to look at me is, but what is your unwillingness to embrace the truth that he was black?
Mm-hmm.
Or what lies in your heart when I mention or you see a black man or a black lady? That's what matters.
And that ties into this video that I saw, where it floated around the internet for a little bit, but it was a white lady, a Caucasian lady, having a dialogue with a young black male about within white society it's frowned upon to date black men.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying, he didn't really do much to defend himself. And, this goes back to black people not having an in-depth understanding who they are and being able to combat this nonsense with truth. But she was saying that she felt that within white society, within white spaces, it's definitely frowned upon, to be dating a black man.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My mom had mentioned, some years ago when I was, younger and all that, like, well, if Dana, when he gets married, I really believe he's going to marry a black lady. And I'm telling you, it was always came out, if my son or daughter would marry, I just know, because God didn't intend us to mix colors. And, young people have, and this reveals truth again. So now you're going to have a mulatto child, and here white individuals are already going to say that child is going to have to face a lot of issues because he's not black, but he's not white, he's this. Well, right there you already show who's created those images, those issues. We have. So right there you've already telling on yourself that black is bad, because if you have a mulatto child, they're going to be deemed as bad because they're going to be associated with black.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and the thing about it is, going back even with the spiritual beliefs and the religion, the gospel is the truth, the Bible is the truth, but you can utilize a religious practice, or you can utilize you can twist what a religion teaches to push the ideology of white supremacy
to meet your agenda.
And that's what they've been doing with that's what's been done with these images, these Eurocentric images, Eurocentric imagery, whether it's through movies, whether it's through television,
That's right.
All of this stuff. And so there was a story that I saw, it was an article that I saw as well, where there was this young white child. His father was a racist, almost like a KKK member or whatever. But the young white child had a dream, and he saw Jesus Christ as a black man. He saw the angels as being black. And he woke up and he asked his dad, why is God and he used the N-word, Nigger. So, you know, and different people are having these visions and things, you know, where they're seeing the Messiah in his true look, his true likeness.
And that's another reason why color matters. You can't find somebody. If I lost a child, I'm going to give them every single detail that I can. I'm not going to say, well, he had hair on his head, you know, he has eyes, he had on a shirt, he had on a pair of pants and a pair of shoes. No, I'm going to say exactly, he has light brown, blondish hair, he's got blue eyes, he's got on a purple shirt with a, you know, with an orange logo on the front, you know, because color matters when you're looking for somebody.
Absolutely.
So all the white evangelicals believing that the rapture is going to happen and that this Jesus is going to come out of the sky and rescue them. Well, you better know who Jesus is and what he looks like, otherwise they're going to do when the black Jesus comes out of that sky, they're going to do what they do to every other black man. They're going to call the cops on them, you know, the Karens and all of them, or they're going to run from them.
Absolutely.
So you do need to know, and if it didn't matter at all, why did the Most High Yah put that in the Word?
Absolutely.
Why did he say he had hair as white as wool? You know, and then we look at our Ashkenazi Jews. Look at the extent of work they go to try to get that lock of hair coming down.
And they're just Jewish anyway.
Yeah. And we
Like-
talk about they're like something,
Yeah,
just
like
like
girlish.
she's boyish, or he's girlish.
Yeah.
He's not a girl, but he acts like a girl.
Yeah,
you know?
bluish. It's
Yeah.
kind of sort of blue.
Yeah, anytime you do ish means it's not the true thing, but it's a representation or it's a copy of something else, or it has characteristics of something else, but not the real deal.
It's a suffix that denotes doubt.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. And a lot of Christians say that they accept Jesus, they love Jesus, and you know, a lot of people make these claims. A real Christian does, real believers, true believers, whether they're Hebrew Israelites grafted in as a Hebrew, a Christian, those that believe the Bible, that have the Bible as their source of nourishment spiritually, they do love God. You know, they love Him. But the issue is within white supremacy, which the majority of the religion that a lot of people are following, in some cases unbeknownst, is really white supremacy.
I speak it all the time. Christianity teaches the worship of a white supremacist God. And that's the foundation of Christianity, is worshiping the God of white superiority.
Well, I mean, it's the white supremacy version that we have in the United States.
Correct.
And that's the thing. How can you can't love Jesus if you don't love his image.
Right.
You can't love somebody and not love their image.
You can't love God if you hate your brother.
That's right.
You know, and a lot of white evangelicals hate their black brothers and sisters. You can't. It doesn't work. How can you love God and yet hate your brother? And that's why it goes back to, you know, well, color doesn't matter. Even if color didn't matter, it matters to you because in your heart you are holding thoughts and truths that are incorrect, that are filled with hate. And that's why it matters.
Absolutely. And then it's a demonic spirit. White supremacy is a demonic spirit that it gets people to hate the image of Christ because Jesus was black, Moses was black. Moses is mistaken indistinguishably by the Cushite girls, the Midianite girls, the Midianites who are a branch of the Cushites, the ancient Egyptian or ancient Mizraite, also black, also African, also descendants of Ham. Moses is mistaken to be these same people. Joseph, his brothers didn't know who he was.
Right.
Also mistaken as an Egyptian. So the Mormons used to teach that black skin, that Ham was cursed. Some of them said Ham, some of the other white supremacist groups try to say it was Cain, was cursed with a skin of blackness.
Yep.
So
and they had no souls. The Mormons used to say you had no soul.
Yeah, so that's saying that Jesus' skin was cursed. They're saying that Moses' skin was cursed. That's saying that a lot of the people in the Bible were cursed. They're saying that Adam and Eve's skin was cursed.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible says that God looked at what He created and said it was good.
Yep.
So this spirit is so blasphemous.
It is.
And demonic.
And then even if it was cursed, let's say it was cursed. Then and because this is one of the things that I had to go through in this awakening was, okay, Christianity. You know, and let me say this too, I probably should have said this before. I know a Christian is supposed to be a follower of Christ. I know I use Christianity, and sometimes I even say Christian, because that word to me is not pure anymore. You know,
Wow.
White supremacy has really, it's like the N-word. The N-word was never created to be a derogatory, you know, depiction of you as a black man. So I'm not going to use that word anymore, unfortunately, because it has been distorted. It is being now used as something that is hurtful and hateful. To me, especially after these 4 years of President Trump, how can I at all use or identify with Christianity? Just like I would never identify as a communist, you know, or a Hitler, you know, a Nazi. And so, I think I just lost my train of thought. You're going to have to cut this
It's
one.
all good. It's all good.
Where was I? So, with being cursed. Where does the cross and the resurrection of Yahshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, then come into play to break that curse?
Exactly.
So if blacks are cursed, if dark skin is cursed, if Ham was cursed, if Cain was cursed, I thought Jesus Christ broke any type of curse, whether it was generational, family, skin color, nation. I thought He broke it. So now you're still lying to me then, Christianity, because you told me the blood is able to break the curses, but yet you're telling me, well, you know what, black people were cursed because of Ham or because of Cain. So His blood isn't strong enough to curse or to break that curse?
Wow. And that's the thing. This spirit of white supremacy has twisted up the Word of God. It's twisted up everything, and people literally believe that there is no payment for it.
Because white supremacy is a god. And that's where I'm at.
It's an idol.
Anytime I think that I'm better than you because of my skin color, what have I automatically done? I put myself in the position of a god. I have automatically made myself a god over you, which is distorting, or like you're saying, is a spirit of to me the Antichrist.
Oh, absolutely.
Because where in the Bible does it say just because I have blonde hair, I'm better than other people? So if I'm going to create a religion that teaches that, then actually in that religion I am teaching that I am some sort of a god. And that is why my white evangelicals created the pre-rapture to think that this white God, or this God that embraces or created white supremacy to reign, you know, is going to save me, the wild branch, if you want to put it that way, from the consequences of our behavior, even though the natural branch had to suffer the consequences of their behavior. Because we almost think we're a god. That's why our church services sometimes are an hour long. And it's almost like, well, God should be happy that I come to church. Because you know what? After an hour, we had to go home because we had other things to do. It was almost like, you know, God, I gave you an hour a week. What more do you want from us? There's that you know, that arrogance, that,
yes.
you know, that privileged mindset.
And the thing about white supremacy also is very assumptive. It's what has happened, what it has done to black people is it's saying that where you come from is bad. And even they've created this so-called ancient Egyptian race controversy as a way to negate or the entirety of what Africa is. And they've also typecasted the rest of Africa to be savage. So like what you were saying with the N-word, The N word is the word Niger spelled with 2 G's. Okay? And so, according to scientific studies, we look at Cambridge University, we look at UNESCO, we find some of the most early forms of iron and metal, metallurgy and iron smelting and ironwork in West Africa. You find the first university, Timbuktu, in West Africa. There are multiple articles that talk about this online. And so what they've done is they've encapsulated falsely the greatness of black people, the greatness of ancient Africa, only into Egypt, when the reality is Egypt just taps the surface. We talk about ancient black civilization. We have those that are inside of Africa and those that are outside of Africa. And so what they've done is this whole thing has been twisted. You know, black people are the foundation of human history. And what you have is, there was a young lady who was trying to do a virtual black history presentation at her school, and it got shut down. You got the shortest month of the year to celebrate the oldest people on the planet. And this thing is so twisted and it's so demonic and so sinful. The first people to contribute are said to have contributed nothing. The first people to build have been said to create nothing.
But destruction.
Exactly.
The opposite.
And so we're being told that we've done nothing by a people that we predate. See, black people have been building and creating before Europeans were even on the planet.
Yeah.
And when they got here, we taught you.
Yep. 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 Well, and I know it was, I believe I read with Christopher Columbus that it was actually a black man that saved his life.
Yeah.
Got him sailed the right, something in that area.
Estebanico.
Okay.
Yeah, Estebanico, he was a Moor.
Okay, yes, there you go.
So what do you think is the consequences of this mistreatment against the true chosen of the Most High? What consequences do you think are going to come?
You know, I think the consequences are going to be beyond our imagination, to be honest. Because if you really look into Revelations, he made it very clear. You know, you say in like 17 and 18 chapter, you know, come out of her, which I believe is, you know, Babylon the Great, which I'm really believing is America and Christianity, the religion of it wrapped up in all that. Because Babylon, I believe in Hebrew, means a religion that declares to be the truth, but its actions and behaviors show or indicate that it's not.
Wow.
And Christianity, white evangelicalism. So the consequences, you know, somebody asked me that once, and I the first thing I told them is, come and drive into the inner city. You know, what was left in Egypt? Just think about that. After all the plagues, then the firstborn sons were killed, and then Pharaoh and his army was killed. So what was left in Egypt after all that? Women and maybe, you know, younger ladies and babies or young men. You know, real young. Because pretty much they were wiped out. You know, the water at one time was tainted, the livestock was killed, the crops were killed. To me, that is almost what we see in the inner city. Right, we see that in the inner city. We have, you know, put drugs, we have done all of this, we've taken the fathers out, we've taken the men out, whether it's by death, you know, shooting and killing them, or putting them in prison, which is our modern day cotton fields. So what is the consequences? It's going to be what we see in our inner city black communities, what white evangelical and what white America has done. But Revelation says that it's going to be doubled or tripled.
Wow.
So the consequences, again, to me, it's just, you look at our inner city, but it's going to be double or triple because that's what the Bible says. And so, you know, the Most High Yah, I thought really, you know, I feel has really shared with me that it's going to be beyond anything we've ever seen. You know, beyond what we've watched in the Schindler's List, you know, or beyond what we've been educated about only with the Holocaust. You know, I think that now that we're going to become educated on what took place during the slave trade and the, you know, the wickedness there, which I think is even going to be greater than what we saw during the Holocaust, it's going to be doubled or tripled. You know, I've had dreams, you know, of white women having babies and their babies being, you know, taken after birth by the legs and literally smashed up against the wall. But it just reminds me of what we did when we used, you know, small black children as bait to catch alligators and crocodiles and but all I know is, first of all, even Christianity has taught me this, that God is a God of justice. That's why he sent his son Yeshua HaMashiach. So he's going to bring justice. And it says in Romans to the wild branch, don't get arrogant or prideful, you know, because remember, if I disciplined and chastised the natural branch, you will not escape it. So I think it's going to be just beyond our imagination. And I believe that at one point we're going to have Russian and Chinese soldiers on this land taking, because the word says those who lead into captivity will be taken into captivity. And so, you know, my people are so focused on you being the enemy that the real enemy, which is within us,
within.
Yeah, is going to overlook also what's coming to get.
And that's what was going on with that state capitol. See, the state capitol, all that was just a showtime rehearsal for the big thing that's coming down the pipe. And so, you know, whether it's coming from, because I got that same sense too before, that it's going to be some kind of foreign incursion that'll finally kind of tip the scales.
Yep.
Because this foundation is faulty.
Yep.
In this country. It's built upon a false Eurocentric history. It's built upon falsehood that they feel will never, that it's so unshakable and so unmovable, but it's not. It's a faulty foundation. And it will one day crumble in due season, and I think that we're starting to see that that power, white supremacy, starting to slip away.
And there is why you see this over support for Trump, because they believe that he was a defender of white supremacy. And you also see that hatred towards Pence because, as we were talking earlier, white supremacy was never made to follow really any rule, law, because they don't even follow the Bible. You know, with guns, the Bible says if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. But yet, you know, you see images of Christians all the time with the Bible, with the cross, with the American flag, and guns, because all of that is entwined. And so I don't need to follow the Bible based on me having a gun to keep my white supremacy. And that's why when Pence refused to stand up for white supremacy instead of the Constitution, which was created to maintain white supremacy, that's why they called him a traitor, like they've called me a traitor.
Yeah, and it's like you pointed out too, that "Don't Tread on Me" flag with the snake on it. It's got an image of a snake on it. And so again, these people, they can tout Christianity all they want to. In the end, they won't spare them for the judgment that's coming, because the reality is that they're not a Christian. They're satanic, religious white supremacists. They have another Jesus that is opposite of the scriptures. You know, a false Messiah that's got blonde hair, blue eyes, white skin, long blonde hair. He's opposite of the scriptures. And he's something else.
And it makes me laugh. Paul actually said in scriptures that if a man had long hair, he was a disgrace. And yet Christianity has created a Jesus with long hair. And I'm thinking, what?
And so that's what it is. It's what they've created is a white supremacist antichrist. And the Bible says it's in either 1st or 2nd Thessalonians where it talks about the man of lawlessness.
Yes.
The
Yes.
Bible says that a man of lawlessness, that the Antichrist would be a man of lawlessness. So like what you were saying about white supremacy, it has no laws.
It has no laws. The only laws it has is laws for others to abide by. And those laws are all made so that white supremacy can survive and thrive.
So that ties in as well with what the Bible says and what Christ says in Revelation, where he talks about, he gives us two different groups. He gives us a group of the true Israel and also a false Israel. He goes as far as to say, and I know the blasphemy of ye which say you are Israel or say you are Jews but do lie.
Yep.
And before that he prefaces that by saying that I know thy works and thy poverty, I know the tribulation, but thou art rich. And he talks about you will know that I have loved you, true Israel. And then but he talks about the blasphemy of the fake Israelites. And then he goes on to say, behold, I will make of them of the synagogue of Satan.
Yep.
So we know right off the bat from the Bible that there are two different groups.
Yep.
There's a real Israel and then there's a false Israel. So that's, we have to look at that and really begin to make heads or tails of what's really going on here.
Yep.
So I want to talk about a little bit about some of the Hebraic elements within so-called African American culture. So this is a term wait, Malik, let me make sure I'm spelling it right. Okay. This is a term that is used to categorize the Hebraic language. This is termed here Hemето-Semitic. And so, of course, this is in reference to some of the sons of Noah, Ham, and Shem in the Bible. Ham, Shem, and Japheth, or Japheth, who are the three sons of Noah in Genesis chapter 10. And so another way or another verbiage of saying Hemето-Semitic is this term here, Afro-Asiatic. Okay? So African Asiatic, this is the Hebrew, this is Hebrew. And also the Arabic language, they all fall up under this category of Hemето-Semitic languages or African Asiatic languages, with the African at the beginning. And what are we classified here in the United States as African Americans. Also, we had, our enslaved ancestors when they came over here were singing Kumbaya, go down Moses way down into Egypt land. Harriet Tubman, one of her original name was a Hebrew name.
Right. And I also did some studying that a lot of the slaves, when they were documented in Jamestown, had Yah
In their
name,
Yep.
which in Hebrew we know means God. And
Absolutely.
the scripture says, they will be called by my name.
Mm-hmm.
And it even goes into like Norwegian. Okay, I'm ancestry, I'm Norwegian.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandmother's name, she was 100% Norwegian. Her last name was Ludvigsen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you have a lot of Johnsons, Peterson, those are all kind of Norwegian, Scandinavian names.
Right.
Well, this is how they got their name.
Mm-hmm.
Ludvigsen. So my grandmother, or my grandmother's dad, my great-grandpa, was the son of Ludwig. Peterson was the son of Peter. Johnson was the son of John. So, even in our names, you had the father's name in that. Just like, your ancestors did.
We have the name of the Father in our names.
Right.
And see, the thing is, going back to the terminology of Afro-Asiatic, even the Asiatic branch of the language is also African. Because a lot of times in the ancient world, Asia was just a satellite
Right.
or an extension of ancient Africa, which predated it for thousands of years. And so that's why even a lot of some of the early on Asian languages bear resemblance to Eastern Sudanic languages. And you know, there's documentation to show that the early dynasties of ancient Asia were founded, quote unquote, founded by the Negro. And there's been anthropological studies based on AtlantaBlackStar.com where they reference anthropology where early on in Asia the people were described as having, quote unquote, oceanic Negroid features. So the Hebrew language in its essence is basically an African language. So is Arabic. So is all language, even classical Greek language, which is classified under the Indo-European family of languages. When we take it back down to formula, it goes back to the Paleo syllabus.
Some deep stuff, and it's gonna, you know, it's gonna take years to learn it all. But I'm grateful, you know, that there's individuals like you that know this like you do to teach the rest of us that don't. But you know, like I tell everybody, just once you step into this revelation of truth, the Most High Yah is so faithful to take you down the journey and bring these necessary things to you so that we can be empowered with this knowledge of not just keeping it ourselves, but to, you know, proclaim it.
Absolutely, and it's one of those things, a learning experience that what I would tell people, that the advice I would give is to just basically divorce your mind out of everything you've been taught here in the United States.
Yep.
Because it's wrong, it's falsehood, there's so much hate and racism, you know, tied up into it, and white supremacy and the feelings of, let me try to make everybody white.
Yep.
Let me whitewash the Bible. Let me whitewash the ancient
Yep.
world and erase the foundation, which is black people.
Yep.
So to maintain the lie of white supremacy,
Yep.
so I can keep the status quo going.
Yep.
So when the black person gets shot, all of society will sit back in America and say, well, they must have done something.
That's right. I know we don't see it in the video. I know it looks like he just put his knee on his neck for, you know, 6-7 minutes, but what happened really before they started filming? You know, or even if it was nothing in that certain situation, well, but he was probably an individual that has a rap sheet, you know. So, but then it gets me too, because now we have a court system that's supposed to prove you innocent or guilty, and I say this all the time. I've been at Cook County Jail as a chaplain. Cook County Jail in Chicago has, oh gosh, there's 11 divisions at least, and there's probably 30,000 inmates, and that's a jail. There is no prison in the city of Chicago. They did build Division 11 that was supposed to be a prison, and they decided they didn't want that, so it's all jail. Mm-hmm. Jail is individuals that are waiting to go to trial. Mm-hmm. And so when I went to Division 10, maximum security, and I would walk in there and I saw the way my Hebrew brothers were treated, mm-hmm. I always thought to myself, but I thought they were innocent until proven guilty. Mm-hmm. Why are they being treated guilty, even though, or why have they been treated as guilty, even though they haven't been proven guilty?
Yeah, and that ties in even what we saw at the state capitol, because some of those people, they were beating up the cops with Blue Lives Matters flags. Yeah. And then, you know, the whole thing, like when they have Black Lives Matters protests, you don't see them do any of that. But they're beating the flag, they're beating the cops with a flag that's supposedly there to represent them, which is really a representation of white supremacy.
Because that cop, if he was true, he would have never stood in the way of what they wanted to do.
Absolutely.
I've stood in the way. That's why I'm hated.
Absolutely.
Mike Pence, at the end, stood in the way. That's why they wanted to kill him.
Absolutely.
Anybody that stands in the way of white supremacy is now excommunicated from, get rid of him, he's wrong.
Absolutely, and that's what all of those imbeciles at the state capitol with their Confederate flags, with their Trump flags. It reminds me of that scripture in the Bible that says this. It says that the spirit of Satan is at work in the sons of disobedience. He is at work on the inside of them. Just like inside of the believer, the Holy Spirit, the Haruach, is working inside of the believer. The spirit of Satan is at work in the children of disobedience to do his will, to weave evil, to cause hatred and division and all these different things.
And we're going to see it manifest itself now because, you know, my white, first of all, they have to be hot or cold.
That's right.
You know, a lot of these white evangelicals, you know, including somebody very close to me, you know, was so pro-Trump, and then all of a sudden now at the end he's a little more anti-Trump. But he's still quiet about it, or it was, well, I don't know what happened to him, but at the end something happened and he changed. And so when I ask, well, when did that so-called change? Because I haven't seen any change in his behavior since he came up. See, then they can't answer that question. But
they're teetering, tottering. And even Biden has said some things that are very much white supremacist.
yes, he is.
You know, there was audio of him saying that, you know, the country's going to hell because African Americans are going to become the going to become the majority, or the minorities are going to become the majority.
Yeah.
And you know, whites will become the minority. And he's saying this in like it's a slight against black folks.
He means it totally against black folks, you know, because again, when us whites become a minority, and I was taught that growing up, you better hope we never become the minority. Or my father taught me growing up, you better hope there never be a black president, because if there is, they're going to do to us what we did to them. But if we didn't do anything to them, why are you worried about them? And see, and then that's the other big lie. That's the biggest lie. I should have been lynched 27 years ago when I moved into an all-black community. I haven't been lynched. I haven't been killed. Haven't been, you know, robbed. Actually, I was robbed once or twice, and it was by some white people that were living in the neighborhood that were drug dealers, and they didn't like the work I was doing out on the street, and they actually robbed me and tried to take my life. And so that to me was a little bit of God's humor, because when everybody told me, see, God is trying to get you out of that inner city, you know, you got to leave those people, they don't want to change, they don't want to get better. I was like, oh, wait a minute, James and Charles Day, they weren't black, they were white. Then they were like, but
that's the problem. The white supremacy of the United States, it only sees blackness or color as being evil and wicked, but it fails to see anything bad if it's a white person. And I believe that could lead to the downfall of this country.
it is. A nation divided within itself will fall.
That's
You know,
what
even
Christ said.
Jesus himself said a nation or a kingdom that is divided against itself will fall. They are now divided. You know, the Republicans are now going against the Democrats because the Democrats at this point are traitors because they are playing the image of acceptance or embracement or empowerment of people of color.
That's right.
But the reality is that's just another depth of deception that they're...
Yeah, and that's the thing, like with Kamala Harris, it's looking like that they want to accept the rulership when they really don't.
No, they don't. They don't.
She wouldn't be in the position she's in if she wasn't so light.
There you go. They used you in the polls to get the votes.
Absolutely.
Not because they love you. Because if they did,
They would
number
change
one,
things.
Biden would have repented first and foremost in front of the nation
Absolutely.
of the things that he has done in the past, that we know he's done,
Absolutely.
that has been you know, a negative, that has crippled you know, our black family members.
Absolutely.
And he's never brought it up.
Absolutely. And they both are white supremacists on
Yes, they
both ends of the spectrum. People talk about the far right and the far left. The difference is the far right is overt in its white supremacy. The far left is covert.
That's right. And then the far right also, brings in the word of God to kind of
twist the scriptures.
to sustain and
Yeah, it has a religious white supremacy that it uses to twist and manipulate with Eurocentric imagery, twisting the scriptures, Eurocentric movies.
I just have to believe that my forefathers saw your dedication to a higher being. I believe it was the Most High Yah. But I believe they did. And they knew, because I see that in white pastors today. They know how to use spirituality or religion or God to really manipulate and to control you, because you are the true chosen people. So you do have that innate desire. And I mean, I just see it in your worship. I see it, and and sometimes these might be stereotypes, but I'm going by my own experience. When I compare my white evangelical people that say they love God versus my black family members that say they love God, there's a complete difference. I mean, when I keep telling my white evangelicals, well, why are you so afraid? Even if we lose, you lose control. Why are you afraid? Isn't your God in control? So where is your faith? Do you have faith?
And where is their God? And my question is this: like we talked about earlier about that book From Babylon to Timbuktu that references the General Pompey in 70 A.D., the migration into southeastern Africa and eventually far into the West. That the original black Hebrews had went into to hide. And so my question is: do you think? And a lot of these people that were Hebrews were given up during the slave trade, during the transatlantic slave trade. Do you think that the white slave owners that came up out of Britain, and you talked about the Hebrew names that our ancestors had with the name of Yah in their name, many of them brought over by the Spanish or on Spanish ships. Do you believe that a lot of them already knew that these were the true chosen people that they brought over here?
Sometimes I do believe they did know, because that's why they had to strip you of the language. That's why they had to strip you of your culture, your name, your identity. They had to strip you. Even the Bible says that in Deuteronomy chapter 28, I believe it is, that everything about you would be taken away and stripped.
Absolutely.
So that they would not know who you really are. So yes, I do believe my forefathers knew who you were. That's why today we have to pay the consequences of that.
Okay.
So, yep. And where is their God? White evangelicals know in the depths of their heart it wasn't God that gave them this land. It was their own wicked, murderous ways. And as long as they can kind of keep that hidden, well, if I don't know, then I don't have to deal with it. But now that I'm bringing it out, we're bringing it out, they don't want to hear that, because now they're responsible without a shadow of a doubt.
Absolutely.
Because they're being made aware of it.
Absolutely.
Because if you believe, if God, what God has for you is you. So if God gave you this great nation, why are you afraid of losing it? Unless you know in the depths of your heart you took this great nation not because God gave it to you, but you took it. And now you're going to be afraid that you got to keep it the same way you took it.
And that's that faulty foundation.
That's that faulty foundation.
That's beginning to crack.
Beginning to crack, because the time is up of the Gentiles.
Wow.
Look, I just thank you. Iron sharpens iron.
That's it. Praise Yah.
Yes, sir. Iron sharpens iron.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, this does it for us right now. Great discussion with our good brother Dana Stevens here.
And I'll be back whether you like it or not.
Absolutely.
You stuck with me now.
He's definitely going to be back. Absolutely.
Can you give us some additional facts of ancient Egypt?
Yes, they would depict themselves differently than how they would depict foreigners. So, for instance, when you look at the tomb of Ramesses III, you will see the ancient Kemites, as they were called historically, the ancient Egyptian called Kemite, and how Sheikh Anta broke it down. He showed the imagery of the Ramesses III's tomb, where the Egyptian would draw himself as black, would draw the Indo-European next, and then draw the other blacks in Africa and draw the Semitics. So A would be the Egyptian, B would be the Indo-European, C would be the other blacks in Africa, and D would be the Asiatic or Semitic Southwest Asians. And you see the ancient Egyptian depicting himself as black, phenotypically African, as well as the other black people in Africa with the same style as the ancient Egyptians, same clothing, same style. And you find it all over the continent of Africa, the same cultural continuity of the ancient Egyptian or ancient Kemite with the rest of Africa, whether it's Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa. There's evidence in South Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, all these different countries all throughout the continent that have different tribes, different ethnic groups that have cultural similarities with the ancient Egyptian.
Gotcha. So there was just the people in the land on the continent pretty much resembled each other, whether you're talking about the north, the south, the west, or the eastern coast.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. So I guess the burning question a lot of people are considering or reconsidering now are, were the children of Israel actually black, people of color?
Yes, they were. Especially when we look at the Bible, Moses is mistaken as an Egyptian. Apostle Paul is also mistaken as an Egyptian. In the previous lesson, I talked about how Count Constantine de Volney, based off of the ancient historians, as well as Gaston Maspero, possibly in the 1800s, based off of the ancient historians' testimony, the people that actually saw them, so these were eyewitnesses that saw what the ancient Egyptians looked like. So you have Lucian saying, describing the ancient Egyptian as being black. You have Apollodorus describing the ancient Egyptian as black. So you have these different Greek historians describing them, describing their skin complexion, and describing their features as being what people would term as being quote unquote sub-Saharan African. And so we know that Moses would have had to look the exact same way. Okay, because he was mistaken to be an Egyptian. Apostle Paul was mistaken to be an Egyptian. So de Volney described the ancient Egyptians as being true Negroes of the same type as all native-born Africans. So Moses must have looked the same way. The Apostle Paul must have looked the same way. When King Herod was trying to go after Jesus, the angel told them to flee into Egypt. So he must have. Joseph and his family, they had to have looked the same way
To blend in
order to blend in with the people there.
What are the effects of a false historical record?
It takes away the identity of a people, especially the people that are called African Americans here in the United States. Having gone through the process of being enslaved here in the United States, there's an identity crisis that exists with these movies, with these pictures, with a history that's not totally truthful. That's not truthful at all. So it's a foundation built upon lies. And generation after generation, we see the effects of it. We see all kinds of thug images, gangster images, but when it comes to the portrayal of an ancient civilization, they have these white actors, they have these actors that don't resemble at all what the biblical characters would have actually looked like, what the ancient history would have actually looked like, due to that detour that Christianity and Judaism took into Europe. And so the images were changed.
And yet, there's still parts of Europe who have a black Madonna.
Absolutely.
And who have a black baby Jesus.
Absolutely.
So it's really, mostly it's a Western civilization sort of perversion. Some Europeans, of course, will cling to that other imagery, but there is some, just to a small degree, of recognition that some of the history has been whitewashed, do you think?
Absolutely. And to add to that point, when you mentioned about the Black Madonna, a good example of that is in Barcelona, Spain, where the people come from miles around to pay homage to this large image of a black Mary and a black Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And even some of the popes and stuff acknowledge a black image of Christ, in picture form and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So
I remember one time when we had talked before, and you had mentioned that it's in Israel, and inside of some of the places where people visit, the paintings on the wall, the disciples actually have afros.
absolutely,
Yeah.
like there was a documentary that showed that, where they would actually go into these dark, hidden places, where they portray the Israelites as being black,
Mm-hmm.
having dark brown skin, afros.
Interesting. So, how did Cleopatra look, or King Tut?
Well, Cleopatra, she would have been sort of mixed, or in some ways somewhat mixed. Maybe not as much as people try to say.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at her skull, when the BBC, they talked about how her sister and her mother, they actually went back and looked at the skeletal structures of the family members of Cleopatra, her sister, as well as her mother, and they had, African characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but Cleopatra's skull also has some little bit of European sort of characteristics. And so, but they still described her as a brown-skinned woman with cornrows.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say, probably similar to how some African Americans are now.
Like Halle Berry.
Mm-hmm. Where, some are a little bit mixed.
Mm-hmm.
But this was during because the time of Cleopatra
Mm-hmm.
is when the Greeks had invaded Egypt. Sort of what I talked about in the previous lesson, where they invaded. And so when the civilization was in decline on it, when it was on its last leg anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and here comes Cleopatra,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's a significance that the Western world puts on her.
Mm-hmm.
You
Well,
know what I mean?
they had Elizabeth. Was it Elizabeth Taylor playing her?
Mhm. And they got a new movie coming out now where there's a Caucasian lady or a European-esque looking person supposed to be portraying Cleopatra.
Gal Gadot.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that's in spite of the
Wonder
facts.
Woman.
Yeah. And that's in spite of the facts of what she would have truthfully looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And there still was an African influence, even during that time of the Greeks. It's not like the Africans just left.
disappeared. Yeah.
Many of them, like I said before, many of them fled back into the south from which they came.
Mm-hmm.
The civilization came from the south or Upper Egypt because the Nile flows from south to the north.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of them went back into the south, and the Greeks occupied a certain portion of Egypt and possibly built some structures and things while they were there.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that it's not like the Africans just left, and there was some, of course there was some mixing, particularly in the northern region of the country.
Mm-hmm.
But it's nothing like what Hollywood is trying to portray.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And people are taking it as fact. That's what's kind of amazing to me. And so you also say that King Tut looked the same.
Yes, King Tut was a black man.
Mm-hmm.
King Tut was black.
Mm-hmm.
We know this based on the statue. The Discovery Channel did a facial reconstruction based off of his skull, based off of what what the Egyptians looked like during that time.
Mm-hmm.
There was no significant intermixture during that time,
Mm-hmm.
and so they were still, as Count Constantine de Volney described, as being true Negroes
Mm-hmm.
of the same type as all the native-born peoples of Africa.
I gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the significance of the African presence in Europe?
Well, definitely, during 200,000 years ago of human
Mhm.
history, everybody on the planet was black.
Mm-hmm.
Very important point.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in Europe was black.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in Asia was black.
And they believe that because all the land masses fit together sort of like a puzzle. If you were to get a map of the world and every part of the land masses, they all fit together. So they feel like somehow they migrated apart is, over hundreds of thousands of years.
Absolutely. It was one mass of land and one nationality of man, and they were black. And when that plate tectonic shift happened, everybody went into their lands or dispersed, or however it went. But everybody up in Europe at one time was black. And even when the temperature changed and they went through that genetic adaptation transformation from being out of a sub-Saharan African to simply being dark-skinned and eventually becoming what we would know today as white or European, broad facial features becoming thin facial features, or wide nostrils becoming thin nostrils. And the genetic change that scientists call OCA2 began to take place. Is a genetic change. So you have two capital A's, those are the dominant genes. Two capital B's are the dominant genes. So a capital B and a lowercase b, so that'll be a dominant gene and a recessive gene.
Right.
The dominant gene is stronger than the recessive genes. So even when that transformation happened, when the Africans that went up into Europe, after they transformed into being Caucasian or being what we would call white,
which happened over several
over time. Absolutely. People think it happened like a real quick thing. It gradually happened. You had people that had literally a black skin with blue eyes, and so, and the ones that were by the sea, especially like the Caspian Sea, and the ones who were, by the water, they would eat the fish out of the water, so they were able to keep that melanin, and so they were able to keep that negroid or Africoid phenotype, because that vitamin D from the fish was a source of vitamin D for them to be able to keep their negroid or Africoid description, sub-Saharan, take your pick, their blackness, if you will, as opposed to the other Northern European hunter-gatherers that spread out through Britain and all those places, during the Ice Age, where that white skin is what produced the vitamin D that the Africans were lacking. So you have cheddar man.
Well, they can absorb it. It's a lot easier for them to absorb. Melanin is actually, it blocks UV, it gives you a protection against UV radiation. And so lighter skin is able to absorb from the sun a lot easier. Black people in this kind of climate, because we are mostly indoors, we don't absorb as much vitamin D. So most people are vitamin D deficient.
Absolutely.
But if vitamin D helps your heart, so either we have to be out in the sun. If we were in Africa, they have huts because most of their lives were outside.
Absolutely.
They didn't have to stay in and be protected, build these fortresses to be protected from the elements, because they were, out in the sun, and, they had the hot temperatures. But when you're in the cold, there's a different adaptation that has to come about, and you're mostly indwelling people.
Absolutely, and being in the cold, it's a different environment, it's a different attitude that comes along with it. Being in a hot environment, there's mangoes and strawberry and, all these different things.
Easier to cultivate.
Yeah. Now, in a cold climate, you don't have all that.
Yeah, you got that hard earth.
You got animals that you may have to kill. Some of them may even begin to eat each other. It just depends. Now, the stereotype people have about Neanderthals is that they were just these savages. That's not true. You see them burying the dead and caring for their young and all of that. So that's them with the Neanderthals. And Cheddar Man's ancestors, coming up out of Africa, migrating through the region that they call the so-called Middle East, through the Bering Straits or whatever, and then migrating northwest up into Europe, into that place called Cheddar Gorge. And so a lot of people try to debate what Cheddar Man looks like.
Yeah, but they finally came to the decision that he was black too.
Absolutely. And the thing is, and one of the ways that scientists knows definitely that he was as dark as he was, and that he still kept that negroid, somewhat negroid phenotype, is because he was missing the genetics that would have made him light skinned, that would have made him look, European. Even though when they test his DNA, he may have the same type of DNA as the Northern Europeans, but his phenotype tells you where he really came from, and that's Africa.
Well, touch on Cheddar Man. Like, who exactly is Cheddar Man for the people who don't know?
Cheddar Man is a skeletal structure
That they found in the British Isles.
Yeah, that they found in the British Isles. It's a place called Cheddar Gorge specifically, and he's supposed to be the oldest,
The first inhabitants.
known,
Yeah.
the first known British, or basically the ancestor of the British people. He gives off an idea of what the original people up in Europe would have looked like. But even him, that was something that happened over time, that straighter hair, because the further back you go, the blacker the history gets, the more African you go as you go move backwards into the ancient world.
Well, all races proceed from, of course, the African continent. That's what they've already kind of. Everyone sort of accepts that, except if you're just.
Well, there was some that didn't. There was a geneticist by the name of Li Jan. He was trying to find a super ancestor of the Chinese, and he thought that they would have evolved on their own, but there was he found out that their ancestry goes back to Africa just like everybody else.
Yep.
Same thing in Korea, and same thing all over Asia, and even in the Middle East as well. The people that were in the region that's the so-called Middle East, quote unquote Middle East, were black as well. And we know based off of their white chromosomes, the artifacts that were left by the original Persians and the original people in that area, that they were all black.
How is it that all races can come from the African sort of, that black gene, let's just say, genomics, and why can't, let's say, a person who's evolved, let's say they're lighter skin, straight hair, why do they stop being able to produce black children, or something like that?
Well, because it goes back to what I was talking about with the genetics. Two capital letters, a capital A and a capital A,
meaning the dominant
gene, and a capital B and a capital B, they can produce children that are any color. And black people are the capital A's, capital B's, because we have the most ancient genetics, and we're the oldest people.
And is it that we're the most diverse? We contain all the blueprint for all people in our DNA.
Right. National Geographic stated that Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on the planet. And so you see all features there, narrow noses, thin facial features, blue eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes. You find that all over. And as you move out of the equator, you begin to see the lightening of the skin as you migrate out of the continent. Now, the Europeans have lowercase b, lowercase a, because they are genetically recessive. They can only make white people. They can only reproduce themselves. They can't make every color like black people can. And so there have been studies done on this. I talked about it before. You have Glodger's Law, Allen's Law, by a man by the name of Constantine Glodger. Constantine Glodger. He studied how organisms start off dark and become light over time in terms of pigmentation. So you have plants that are very dark green, able to produce plants that are lighter. You can take roses, for instance. The dark red roses can, when you crossbreed them, they can make light pink roses or even white roses. And so this is applicable for human beings as well, and that's what Shankan Joe talked about, and I've already covered that in the previous lesson. But that's what it was. The dominant genes can produce everything.
Now I have a question. We mentioned Ms. Godot. Why is it today, if the Israelites were black, and biblically speaking, why are they mostly they look to be of European descent now. I mean, they're in Israel. I mean, there are black and white, people in Jerusalem and in that area now. But it just seems like most everybody is of European descent.
Well, it's because there's a difference between a Hebraic Jew and an Ashkenazi Jew or a European Jew. A lot of the European Jews' ancestors signed into the religion of Judaism.
They were converts.
They were converts. Now, some of them, they definitely have what you would call the Kohanim gene. And they do. Some of them do definitely have. The Jewish male specifically has the Kohanim gene. But a lot of that has to deal with a branching off and some intermixture, into Europe.
So some of that, it's believed that the African Israel Hebrews went into Europe, ventured into the mountains of Russia and Germany. That's where the Ashkenazi
a pocket of them possibly could have intermixed with some of them, because you can have people that are as black as Wesley Snipes or as black as somebody in Senegal, and gradually over time begin to intermix at a certain amount of time where the intermixture becomes more significant. And they become the descendants become lighter complected over time. Now, when we're talking about the ancient world again, the further back we go, the blacker the history gets. So during biblical times and ancient times, they were black, they were African, they were phenotypically African. And so Strongbow talks about who's a Greek historian, he talks about the Israelites as being of an Ethiopian or Cushitic origin. And that has to deal with the fact that there were only 70 Hebrews. They were already dark-skinned Hebrew people from the jump, coming up out of the Ur of the Chaldeans. These are very dark-skinned people. Abraham's father, Terah, came from the Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham himself came from the Ur of the Chaldeans. So their descendants were only 70 in number. When they got into Kemet, or so-called Egypt, what the Greeks renamed Egypt, they go off and start intermixing with the Cushites and the Egyptians and the Canaanites, all these different Africans. Judah's wife was a Canaanite, and Joseph's wife was an Egyptian or a Chemite, and so there was no difference in the look between Hebrews and Egyptians, because at that point they were all looking like the Egyptians.
Because they were all the same phenotype.
Same phenotype. And so that's how you can mistake one for the other. That's how Moses was able to be mistaken as an Egyptian.
That's when he killed somebody.
He killed somebody, and he was mistaken as an Egyptian. The Midianite girls, the Midianites, who were also a branch of the Cushites, who were also Africans.
As his wife was
his wife. Yeah, she was a Cushite. She was a Midianite. As well as her father, and so. Moses, they were African. They were all black. You couldn't tell
one from the other.
One away from the other.
Yeah. Okay.
The Midianite girls thought that Moses was an Egyptian. The Roman soldier thought that Apostle Paul was an Egyptian. So the original Vikings were black, and one of the main ways that we know that is through the Gaelic language. I'm gonna discuss a term that the Northern Europeans actually used to refer to the Vikings as. And there was this term here. Dubgal. So this is actually two words. You have this word here, dub, which translates as black. And then you have this term here, gal, G-A-L-L. Gal translates as invader / foreigner. So the Northern Europeans were literally refer to the Vikings as Dubgal. This word dub also can mean dark. So they literally refer to them as dark foreigners black invaders. Also, in the case of Scandinavia, you find modern humans migrating out of Africa, going up into Britain 40,000 years ago. In the case of Scandinavia, 42,000 years ago. Everybody there, black. The next group I want to talk about is the Celts. So the original Celts were also black, okay? And one of the main ways that we know that, there was a Greek historian around 405 BC named Ephorus, who described the original Celts as looking just like the Ethiopians. And so I've already discussed that this term Ethiopians comes from the Greek word ethos, which means burnt faces or black faces, and Ethiopians are also called Cushites, which the word Cush in Hebrew, I've already discussed, means black. And that the entire continent of Africa was once called Kush, or Ethiopia, or Balad al-Sudan. So basically what Ephorus in 405 BC is saying is that the Celts are looking just like sub-Saharan Africans, Negroes, blacks. The Northern Europeans adopted the culture of the original Celts that were black, that were phenotypically African, and they just utilized their culture. So there are many terms, there are many ancient words that are in reference to black people, in reference to Africans. And one of these terms is this term here. Phenas. Okay? And what this term translates as dark, black, the Nubian. Okay, so this is a very ancient term that is used to describe Africans. And this is what it translates to, Phenas. Phenas, dark, black, the Nubian. And also, an ongoing controversy within the United States, within the Western world, within scholarship, is the ancient Moors. Many people try to argue about the ethnicity or the phenotype of the Moors. And so, within the Greek language, you have this word here, morvo, which means blackened, burnt, charred. So that's what the term morvo means in the classical Greek. This is what it translates as in the classical Greek. In the Latin, you have the word Moor, spelled as this, M-A-U-R, translates as black. In the English language, the term Moor also means black. So the Oxford English Dictionary says that the term Moor means black, often swarthy. Hence the term is used for the word Negro. So the Oxford English Dictionary is telling us that the term Moor is used interchangeably with the term Negro. Also, the Imperial English Dictionary, when you look at the term Moor, it states in the dictionary, it says that the word Moor means Negro, a black man. So that's the Imperial English Dictionary. Okay? So the significance of the Moors go into Europe and they teach the Europeans there. These are black people from about of Western Africa and northwestern Africa that go into Europe and teach the Europeans how to bathe, teach them the arts and the sciences, and even the use of speech. In a more later on sense. Okay. Now, before that, when we talk about prehistoric man, when we go all the way back to Homo neanderthalensis, what scientists call Homo neanderthalensis, okay, there within the British Museum, Chris Stringer, he states that after that 60,000 year period of the Homo neanderthalensis, who at this point, many of them have lost their pigmentation and have begun to become European, phenotypically. The Africans, 20,000 years later, after that 60,000 year period, they go back up into Europe and they teach the Homo neanderthalensis and their descendants higher forms of arts and sciences, better forms of art, better forms of tool making. And all of this you can find within the British Museum. You can find these old artifacts, old spears, old objects that date back over 60,000 years old. So that's a part of the significance of the Moors. And so you have people such as General Tariq that goes in and fights the Visigoths, who are at the time the Spanish army. And he and his Moorish army defeats them. And also great military genius from people such as Hannibal de Barca. Further evidence for the blackness of the Moors, as well as the ancient Phoenicians. We have information by two anthropologists, one named Lucien Berthelon and another one by the name of Ernest Chatre. They went all throughout North Africa and Egypt, all around those areas of North Africa where Carthage was. And they found out that there are skeletal structures of the Carthaginians, the Moors, and even the ancient Phoenicians, that these were all Negroid bones, that these were all Africoid bones, the cranial structure, as well as the statues that were left behind from ancient Carthage, that these are African people, these are Negroid people of the same ethnic stock as all the native-born peoples of Africa. Dr. Chancellor Williams stated this. He said that the Moors, like the original Egyptians, were black Africans. So we have the skeletal structures that have been found by Dr. Lucien Berthelon and Ernest Chatre, confirming the Negroid or African essence of the ancient Carthaginians and the Moors, being of the same ethnic stock as all the native peoples of Africa. And this would include the time of Hannibal de Barca, who was also black, who was also of the same ethnic stock as all the other Moors.